The closed circle of manufactured certainty. How movements born to liberate the human mind were gradually conditioned into systems of conformity, moral policing, and cognitive compression. Pre-introduction: what it would actually mean to protect humanity. If the stated goals of modern society are truly to protect humanity, to defend freedom, to uphold equality, and to preserve the hard-won gains of human rights and civil rights movements, then it becomes necessary to ask an uncomfortable question: are the dominant ways we think, speak, and organize ourselves today actually capable of sustaining those goals, or have they quietly begun to undermine them? This question cannot be answered through slogans, identity signaling, or moral certainty. It requires a willingness to examine the foundations of our beliefs, including those we consider most enlightened, progressive, or spiritually evolved. Every meaningful advance in human freedom has required the capacity to tolerate difference without annihilation, to sit with contradiction without panic, and to allow unfamiliar or unsettling ideas to exist without immediately classifying them as threats. Civil rights movements, philosophical revolutions, and spiritual awakenings did not emerge from consensus or comfort. They emerged from long periods of disagreement, suffering, and sustained inquiry, often led by people who were misunderstood, rejected, or punished by the dominant moral frameworks of their time. These movements expanded consciousness not by making ideas more palatable, but by making reality impossible to ignore. If humanity is to be protected, then the conditions that allow humanity to flourish must also be protected. These conditions include depth of thought, freedom of inquiry, emotional range, bodily reality, and the ability to encounter difference without resorting to exile or domination. These capacities are not abstract ideals but state-dependent human realities, rooted in the body, the nervous system, and the shifting conditions of lived experience. All emotional and mental states carry signal and movement, none exist outside of this continuum, and none are inherently superior. Expansion and contraction, clarity and confusion, vitality and collapse each serve necessary functions at different moments. When cultures attempt to enforce a narrow range of acceptable states, whether framed as positivity, coherence, regulation, or spiritual advancement, they confuse stability with health and compliance with growth. Organic human flourishing depends on the ability to move gradually and responsively across the full spectrum of states, according to what the body and context require. Forced or abrupt displacement from one state into another, especially under moral or ideological pressure, is not liberatory but destabilizing, and is particularly damaging for disabled, neurodivergent, or actively healing people. Any culture that prioritizes immediate legibility over truth, harmony over honesty, or belonging over understanding places these conditions at risk, no matter how compassionate its language may sound. This work begins from the premise that the true danger to freedom does not always arrive wearing the face of overt authoritarianism. It often arrives as well-intentioned simplification, as the desire to make complex truths easier to digest, easier to agree on, easier to enforce. Over time, this impulse trades open inquiry for shared identity, and living movements for closed systems. When that happens, the language of liberation remains, but its substance drains away. To protect humanity, then, is not merely to defend particular positions or communities, but to defend the underlying capacity for human beings to think freely, feel honestly, and engage reality without fear of moral annihilation. That is the deeper project this work undertakes, not to tear down spirituality, liberalism, or psychology, but to ask whether they can still serve that purpose, and if not, what must change. Introduction: what is actually being claimed. This work makes a claim that will sound uncomfortable to many people precisely because it challenges ideas that currently present themselves as compassionate, progressive, spiritual, and enlightened. The claim is not that people involved in liberal movements or New Age spirituality are unintelligent, malicious, or consciously participating in harm. Nor is the claim that there exists a single hidden group secretly orchestrating belief systems from behind the scenes. Framing the issue that way would itself be a form of intellectual evasion. The claim being made here is more difficult to dismiss and more difficult to confront. Large segments of modern liberal culture and New Age spirituality have become structured systems of thought conditioning that discourage deep inquiry, suppress embodied and descending perspectives, moralize emotional states, and quietly exile those who do not conform while continuing to describe themselves as open-minded, healing-oriented, and liberatory. This conditioning did not arise from one source, one ideology, or one historical moment. It emerged gradually through the convergence of metaphysical belief systems, psychological frameworks, mass persuasion techniques, institutional incentives, and more recently algorithmic attention economies. Over time, these forces reshaped how people understand goodness, safety, intelligence, morality, and even reality itself. What began as movements dedicated to expanding consciousness and freeing thought have, in many cases, become movements that standardize consciousness and police thought. This work does not argue that emotions like positivity, calm, hope, or optimism are inherently harmful. All emotional, cognitive, and psychological states are forms of signal and movement, not moral achievements or failures. There is no neutral or non-vibrational position from which a person can think, feel, or heal. What matters is not maintaining a permanently elevated state, but having access to the full range of states required by reality, context, and the body's needs. States often labeled as low, negative, or regressive grief, anger, collapse, withdrawal, confusion are not obstacles to health or consciousness, but essential phases of integration, protection, and truth processing. Conversely, elevated or expansive states can become harmful when imposed, prolonged, or demanded out of sync with a person's physiological or neurological capacity. Human flourishing depends on gradual, responsive movement across this full spectrum. Abrupt or enforced shifts, especially under moral or spiritual pressure, are destabilizing and disproportionately damaging to disabled, neurodivergent, or actively healing people. It does not argue that psychological tools, therapeutic language, or spiritual practices are useless or invalid. It does not argue against compassion, accountability, or personal responsibility. Those are strawman defenses that protect the system from examination. Instead, this work argues that when positivity becomes a moral requirement rather than a situational tool, it suppresses reality. When discomfort is framed as harm, learning becomes impossible. This reframing does not eliminate these states, it merely strips them of legitimacy. Emotional and physiological states that arise naturally in response to injustice, loss, uncertainty, or structural harm do not disappear when labeled unacceptable. They are driven underground, where they lose language, context, and communal containment. What was once understood as part of a necessary human and collective process is reclassified as personal failure or energetic deficiency, severing people from their own signals and from one another. In doing so, movements collapse a complex, dynamic spectrum of human states into a simplistic hierarchy, where certain modes of being are treated as inherently higher, cleaner, or more evolved than others. This hierarchy mistakes surface coherence for health and misunderstands slower, denser, or inward-turning states as regression, rather than recognizing them as essential phases of grounding, integration, and repair. Living systems do not heal through perpetual expansion, but through rhythmic movement between activation and rest, expression and assimilation. When access to these grounding states is morally restricted, people are pressured to perform alignment rather than engage in the slow, embodied work of processing reality, and the movement loses its capacity to metabolize life as it is. When complex human states are reduced to labels, understanding collapses. When short-form, emotionally simplified communication becomes the dominant mode of meaning-making, depth and revolutionary thought are structurally eliminated. When communities define safety as emotional uniformity, they inevitably punish difference. When belonging requires palatability, disabled, traumatized, chronically ill, and materially marginalized people are pushed out not accidentally, but predictably. The result is a culture in which people believe they are thinking freely while operating inside narrow, enforced cognitive boundaries. Dissent is not debated, it is diagnosed. Complexity is not explored, it is labeled dangerous. Suffering is not contextualized, it is individualized and moralized. Exile is not named as such, it is rebranded as boundaries, self-care, or alignment. This is not an abstract philosophical problem. It has material consequences. It shapes who receives support and who is abandoned. It determines whose pain is considered valid and whose is considered inconvenient. It decides which perspectives are allowed to exist and which are quietly erased. Most critically, it undermines the very capacities that historically made spiritual and liberal movements transformative in the first place: long-form thinking, tolerance for contradiction, willingness to be uncomfortable, and commitment to material solidarity over moral performance. This work therefore asks the reader to consider a disturbing possibility. That many of the ideas currently celebrated as enlightened, progressive, and healing are not actually freeing people's minds but gently, efficiently, and systemically closing them. What follows is not an attack on spirituality or liberalism as ideals. It is an attempt to recover their original function by tracing how they were diverted, diluted, and disciplined into forms that now serve stability, conformity, and social sorting far better than they serve truth, liberation, or genuine human care. This is not a call to reject meaning, care, or ethics. It is a call to reclaim depth, contradiction, embodiment, and intellectual courage, the very qualities these movements were once willing to suffer for, and are now trained to avoid. 2. From liberation to orthodoxy. Movements that arise in response to domination, stagnation, or injustice almost always begin as acts of refusal. They are born from a recognition that something essential has been constrained, silenced, or distorted, and that existing structures of authority can no longer be trusted to tell the truth about human experience. Early spiritual movements, philosophical schools, and liberal political projects were not built on comfort or consensus, but on disruption. They demanded that people think beyond inherited dogma, tolerate uncertainty, and risk social punishment for seeing differently. In their earliest forms, these movements were defined less by shared conclusions than by shared openness, an insistence that truth could not be reduced to slogans and that moral certainty was something to be interrogated rather than performed. Over time, however, as such movements grow, attract followers, and become culturally influential, a shift almost always occurs. What began as inquiry slowly transforms into identity. What began as a challenge to authority begins to accumulate authority of its own. This transition is not usually marked by a single betrayal or moment of corruption, but by a gradual reorientation of priorities. The original question, what is true, gives way to the more socially stabilizing question, what does someone like us believe? Once a movement reaches this stage, cohesion becomes more valuable than exploration, and predictability becomes more valuable than insight. The movement begins to protect itself, not from oppression, but from internal instability. In earlier eras, this hardening into orthodoxy was slowed by material limits. Communication was slower, ideas traveled through books, speeches, and debates that required sustained attention, and disagreement could exist within a movement for years or decades without immediate resolution. People had time to sit with contradiction, to argue at length, to change their minds gradually, or to remain in uneasy coexistence with others who did not fully agree. Orthodoxy still formed, but it formed slowly, often after generations of conflict and synthesis. What distinguishes the present moment is the speed and efficiency with which orthodoxy now consolidates. Digital communication, social media platforms, and attention-based economies reward immediate legibility and punish ambiguity. Ideas that can be compressed into emotionally resonant phrases spread rapidly, while ideas that require context, history, or careful reasoning struggle to survive. Movements operating within these conditions are subtly pressured to simplify themselves, to distill their values into repeatable language, to define clear moral boundaries that can be easily recognized and enforced. Over time, this produces cultures that appear vibrant and progressive on the surface, yet are internally rigid, intolerant of deviation, and hostile to slow or unconventional forms of thought. As a result, modern liberal and spiritual spaces increasingly resemble the very structures they once opposed. Instead of religious doctrine, there are now approved vocabularies. Instead of heresy, there is misalignment. Instead of sin, there is toxicity. Instead of excommunication, there are boundaries that function as quiet exile. The outward language is secular, therapeutic, or spiritual rather than explicitly religious, but the underlying mechanism is the same. Belonging is conditional, moral worth is publicly signaled, and deviation is framed not as disagreement but as deficiency. Crucially, this transformation is often invisible to those inside it because the new orthodoxy defines itself as openness. People are taught that they are more evolved, more conscious, more compassionate than those outside the movement, and that dissent therefore does not represent an alternative perspective but a failure of awareness or morality. This framing allows conformity to masquerade as enlightenment and obedience to masquerade as ethical clarity. The more a community insists that it has transcended dogma, the less equipped it often becomes to recognize its own. This process also shifts the emotional landscape of movements. Early liberatory struggles were rarely pleasant. They involved grief, rage, despair, exhaustion, internal conflict, and prolonged uncertainty. They demanded the capacity to remain present with suffering without immediately resolving it into meaning or virtue. As movements harden into orthodoxy, these emotional states become liabilities rather than sources of insight. Discomfort is reinterpreted as harm, anger as toxicity, grief as low vibration, and doubt as danger. Emotional range narrows, and with it, the movement's capacity to respond to reality. This reframing does not eliminate these states, it merely strips them of legitimacy. Emotional and physiological states that arise naturally in response to injustice, loss, uncertainty, or structural harm do not disappear when labeled unacceptable. They are driven underground, where they lose language, context, and communal containment. What was once understood as part of a necessary human and collective process is reclassified as personal failure or energetic deficiency, severing people from their own signals and from one another. In doing so, movements collapse a complex, dynamic spectrum of human states into a simplistic hierarchy, where certain modes of being are treated as inherently higher, cleaner, or more evolved than others. This hierarchy mistakes surface coherence for health and emotional contraction for regression, ignoring the reality that living systems require oscillation. Expansion without rest, clarity without confusion, and positivity without grief are not signs of advancement but of disconnection. When access to the full range of states is restricted or morally policed, individuals are pressured to perform alignment rather than inhabit truth, and the movement loses its capacity to metabolize reality as it is. What emerges is a paradoxical situation in which movements dedicated to liberation increasingly require psychological uniformity. People are expected not only to agree, but to feel correctly, to express themselves in sanctioned ways, and to process their experiences according to approved frameworks. Those who cannot do this, because of trauma, disability, neurodivergence, material precarity, or simply a different way of understanding the world, find themselves subtly pushed to the margins. Their presence disrupts the image of harmony and progress the movement wishes to project, and so they are reframed as problems to be managed rather than people to be understood. This is how liberation curdles into orthodoxy without announcing itself. There is no dramatic reversal, no explicit declaration that inquiry is no longer welcome. Instead, the movement quietly changes what it rewards and what it punishes. Depth becomes impractical, dissent becomes unsafe, and complexity becomes suspect. Over time, only those who can mirror the movement back to itself remain visible, while those who challenge its assumptions fade from view. The circle closes, and what remains is not freedom, but a carefully maintained image of it. 3. The moralization of inner states. One of the most consequential shifts in modern spiritual and liberal culture is the transformation of internal human states from sources of information into markers of moral worth. Emotions that were once understood as situational, biological, relational, and deeply contextual have been reclassified as indicators of character, consciousness, or ethical development. In this framework, positivity becomes not merely desirable but virtuous, while so-called negative emotions become not merely uncomfortable but suspect. This shift appears subtle because it often presents itself in the language of self-improvement, healing, or growth, yet its implications are far-reaching and profoundly limiting. Historically, emotional states were not treated as evidence of goodness or badness in themselves. Fear was understood as a response to danger, grief as a response to loss, anger as a response to violation or injustice, despair as a response to prolonged deprivation or overwhelm. These states were signals, adaptive responses shaped by evolution and experience, communicating information about the world and one's position within it. Even spiritual traditions that sought transcendence generally acknowledged the necessity of passing through suffering rather than bypassing it. Enlightenment, where it was spoken of at all, was framed as something that emerged through confrontation with reality, not through avoidance of it. In contrast, contemporary spiritual and progressive spaces increasingly frame inner states as achievements or failures. Calmness is read as maturity, optimism as alignment, emotional regulation as moral superiority, while distress is reframed as resistance, ignorance, or lack of growth. This creates a silent hierarchy of emotional legitimacy in which certain experiences are rewarded with belonging and validation, while others are quietly penalized. People learn, often unconsciously, that to be accepted they must not only think correctly but feel correctly, or at least perform the appearance of correct feeling. This moralization of emotion is illogical at its core because it confuses cause with virtue. An emotional state does not arise in a vacuum. It emerges from the interaction between a nervous system and its environment. Chronic fear may reflect chronic insecurity, poverty, discrimination, violence, or illness. Persistent grief may reflect repeated loss or the absence of meaningful support. Anger may reflect unmet needs, broken boundaries, or sustained injustice. To treat these states as evidence of personal failure rather than information about conditions is to erase reality in favor of narrative comfort. The appeal of this framework lies in its promise of control. If positivity is good and negativity is bad, then one can maintain moral standing by regulating inner experience rather than confronting external conditions. This is deeply attractive in a world marked by instability, inequality, and complexity. It offers a sense of mastery, a belief that one can rise above circumstance through correct mindset, correct vibration, correct orientation. But this promise comes at a cost. When internal states are moralized, suffering becomes shameful, and shame drives concealment rather than healing. Over time, this creates cultures of emotional performance rather than emotional truth. People learn to curate their inner lives for public consumption, emphasizing lightness, ease, and resilience while suppressing confusion, despair, rage, or exhaustion. This does not eliminate these states, it simply pushes them underground, where they often intensify. What cannot be acknowledged cannot be integrated, and what cannot be integrated often emerges as projection, burnout, or quiet collapse. The concept of high vibration versus low vibration functions as one of the clearest expressions of this moral hierarchy. Though often presented as neutral or even scientific, this language is metaphorical at best and misleading at worst. This does not mean that internal states lack energetic, physiological, or measurable dimensions. Thought, emotion, and bodily state all involve movement, rhythm, density, and signal, and in that sense all experience exists along a spectrum of activation and depth. The error is not in recognizing energetic variation, but in treating faster, lighter, or more expansive states as inherently superior to slower, heavier, or more grounded ones. Descriptive differences are converted into moral rankings, and the body's need for processing, settling, and integration is overridden by ideological preference. In living systems, no single range of activation is optimal at all times. States associated with intensity, expansion, or elevation can be restorative or destructive depending on duration and context, just as states associated with slowness, contraction, or withdrawal can be protective, integrative, or necessary for survival. Health does not mean remaining in a higher state, but retaining the capacity to move gradually and responsively across the full spectrum as conditions require. When people are pressured to inhabit states far from where their bodies actually are, especially abruptly or under moral framing, the result is not healing but disorientation, injury, and loss of self-trust. In physical systems, frequency and wavelength are descriptive properties, not value judgments. In fact, when examined more closely, the cultural fixation on high vibration often reflects a misunderstanding of how waves function at all. Higher frequency states involve shorter wavelengths and more rapid oscillation, which can appear bright, energized, or elevated, but are also more taxing to sustain and more disruptive to biological systems over time. Slower, lower frequency states involve longer wavelengths, broader arcs of movement, and greater capacity for integration. They allow signals to travel, settle, and be processed through the body rather than fragmenting it into constant adjustment. From this perspective, the insistence on maintaining perpetual high vibration is not a sign of vitality but of stasis and inability to descend, widen, or complete a cycle. Grounded states associated with slowness, gravity, and depth are not the absence of movement, but the conditions that allow real change, repair, and reorganization to occur. In this sense, much of the prevailing cultural programming reverses the logic of living systems, mistaking constant excitation for growth and mistaking the long, slow waveforms of healing for failure or decline. In biological systems, slower states such as rest, withdrawal, or conservation of energy are essential for repair and survival. Yet within spiritualized discourse, high becomes synonymous with good, pure, advanced, and safe, while low becomes associated with contamination, danger, and regression. This inversion of embodied reality trains people to distrust their own nervous systems whenever they fall outside the approved emotional range. The consequences of this are especially severe for people whose lives make sustained positivity impossible or inappropriate. Disabled people, chronically ill people, neurodivergent people, traumatized people, and those living under material precarity often inhabit bodies and minds that cycle through pain, fatigue, dysregulation, and grief as a matter of course. When emotional states are moralized, these individuals are not merely unsupported, they are implicitly judged. Their suffering becomes evidence of misalignment rather than a call for care. Inclusion becomes conditional upon the ability to mask, regulate, or aestheticize distress, which is itself a form of exclusion. This framework also erodes collective responsibility. When suffering is framed as an individual emotional failure, attention is diverted away from structural causes and shared obligations. Rather than asking what conditions produce widespread anxiety, despair, or anger, communities focus on helping individuals shift their mindset. Rather than addressing injustice, they encourage resilience. Rather than redistributing resources, they promote gratitude. In this way, the moralization of inner states functions as a quiet stabilizer of existing power arrangements, not through overt coercion, but through the internalization of blame. Perhaps most insidiously, this system teaches people to fear their own depth. Emotions that once served as gateways to insight become threats to belonging. Anger that might have fueled resistance is reframed as toxicity. Grief that might have deepened solidarity is reframed as heaviness. Doubt that might have sharpened understanding is reframed as negativity. Over time, people learn to abandon the very inner signals that could lead them to question, resist, or transform the conditions shaping their lives. In this way, the moralization of inner states does not simply distort emotional life, it constrains thought itself. When only certain feelings are permitted, only certain questions can be asked. When discomfort is treated as danger, inquiry becomes impossible. Movements that once depended on emotional honesty, rage at injustice, and grief for what was lost find themselves unable to tolerate the very forces that once made them alive. What remains is a sanitized version of liberation, stripped of its depth, its messiness, and its power. On adaptation, evolution, and the misuse of scientific language in modern spiritual and liberal thought. One of the most revealing distortions in contemporary spiritual and liberal discourse is the way the language of adaptation, evolution, and growth has been detached from its scientific meaning and repurposed as a moral sorting system. Terms that once described slow, context-dependent processes shaped by constraint, trade-offs, and survival pressures are now used to imply linear improvement, emotional pleasantness, and ideological correctness. In popular usage, to be evolved is to be calm, agreeable, optimistic, regulated, and aligned with prevailing norms, while to be distressed, resistant, angry, or conflicted is framed as evidence of being less evolved, behind, or stuck. This inversion bears little resemblance to how adaptation or evolution actually function in living systems. In biological terms, adaptation is not synonymous with improvement, enlightenment, or harmony. It is the process by which organisms adjust, often imperfectly and under duress, to the conditions they inhabit. Adaptations are shaped by scarcity, threat, competition, injury, and failure as much as by opportunity. They are local solutions to local problems, not universal upgrades. What is adaptive in one environment may be maladaptive in another, and many adaptations involve significant cost, including pain, vulnerability, or loss of capacity in other domains. Evolution does not select for comfort or positivity, it selects for survival and reproduction within specific constraints, often through mechanisms that are brutal, inefficient, and indifferent to individual well-being. Psychological adaptation follows similar principles. Nervous systems evolve and develop in response to lived conditions, not abstract ideals. Hypervigilance, dissociation, emotional numbing, aggression, withdrawal, and anxiety are not signs of moral or developmental failure, they are contextually intelligible responses to environments that were unsafe, unpredictable, or overwhelming. In many cases, these responses once served protective functions, allowing individuals to survive situations they could not escape. To label such adaptations as low vibration, unconscious, or unevolved is to misunderstand both their origin and their function. This misunderstanding is often intensified by the selective borrowing of scientific language without its underlying constraints. While biological and neurological processes do involve rhythms, oscillations, activation levels, and pattern signaling, these properties are descriptive rather than prescriptive. They do not point toward a single optimal state, speed, or frequency, but toward context-sensitive regulation across time. Living systems survive and adapt through fluctuation, not fixation. Any framework that treats one range of activation as inherently superior, more evolved, or more correct than others is no longer describing biology, psychology, or physics, but imposing a moral narrative onto processes that are inherently situational and relational. Yet in modern spiritual and liberal communities, adaptation is often reframed as a matter of attitude rather than environment. People are told they must evolve past anger, fear, grief, or resistance, as though these states were remnants of a primitive self rather than signals arising from present conditions. Growth is portrayed as a smooth ascent toward calmness and positivity, rather than as a nonlinear process involving regression, destabilization, and reorganization. This narrative is emotionally appealing because it offers the illusion of mastery, suggesting that one can transcend suffering through insight alone, but it collapses under scrutiny because it ignores the material and relational factors that shape human behavior. From a scientific perspective, genuine adaptation often looks chaotic rather than serene. Systems under stress do not become more orderly, they become more variable. Learning, whether neural, behavioral, or cultural, frequently involves periods of confusion, emotional volatility, and disintegration before new patterns stabilize. This is true in individual development, where growth spurts are often accompanied by dysregulation, and it is true in social systems, where transformation is rarely polite or calm. To demand that people appear regulated and pleasant while undergoing change is to demand that they suppress the very signals that indicate adaptation is occurring. The misuse of evolutionary language also introduces a covert hierarchy. By framing certain emotional states, beliefs, or behaviors as more evolved, communities position themselves as arbiters of developmental status. Those who conform are seen as advanced, while those who struggle are framed as lagging behind. This is not science, it is social stratification disguised as progress. Historically, similar logic has been used to justify colonialism, eugenics, and the marginalization of disabled and racialized populations, all under the banner of advancement and civilization. While contemporary versions are less overt, the structural logic remains disturbingly familiar. In spiritualized contexts, this distortion is compounded by the conflation of evolution with transcendence. People are encouraged to rise above bodily needs, emotional pain, and material constraints, as though these were obstacles to growth rather than the terrain in which growth occurs. The body becomes something to manage or override, rather than a source of intelligence. Slowness, fatigue, limitation, and dependency are treated as failures of adaptation rather than as intrinsic aspects of human life. This framing disproportionately harms those whose bodies do not conform to ideals of productivity, resilience, or aesthetic wellness. In liberal contexts, a parallel distortion occurs when adaptation is framed as personal responsibility divorced from structural reality. Individuals are told to adapt to precarious labor, rising inequality, social fragmentation, and chronic stress by cultivating better coping skills, emotional regulation, and positive outlooks. Structural violence is reframed as a test of resilience. Those who cannot adapt smoothly are framed as resistant, fragile, or unwilling to grow. In this way, the language of adaptation becomes a tool for normalizing injustice rather than challenging it. What is lost in all of this is a fundamental scientific insight: adaptation is relational. It emerges from the interaction between organisms and environments, individuals and systems. To support genuine adaptation, one must attend not only to inner states but to external conditions, not only to mindset but to material support, not only to regulation but to safety. Evolution does not demand that organisms feel good, it demands that they respond appropriately to reality. Sometimes that response is joy, sometimes it is rage, sometimes it is withdrawal, sometimes it is grief. All of these states can be part of an adaptive process, depending on context. By redefining adaptation as perpetual positivity, emotional smoothness, and ideological alignment, modern spiritual and liberal cultures undermine the very processes they claim to support. They train people to distrust their own responses, to override their own signals, and to measure growth by appearance rather than function. This produces individuals who are superficially compliant but internally fragmented, outwardly calm but inwardly disconnected from their own needs and limits. True evolution, whether biological, psychological, or cultural, is not tidy. It is uneven, disruptive, and often painful. It involves confronting constraints rather than denying them, reorganizing systems rather than decorating them, and tolerating instability rather than suppressing it. Any framework that promises growth without discomfort, adaptation without disruption, or evolution without cost is not describing reality. It is describing a fantasy designed to preserve order, not to foster life. When movements mistake this fantasy for science, they do more than misinform. They train people to close their minds to evidence that contradicts the narrative, to judge themselves and others for perfectly intelligible responses to real conditions, and to accept a shallow version of growth that leaves underlying structures untouched. In doing so, they turn the language of evolution into a tool of conformity, and the promise of transformation into a mechanism of restraint. Vibrations, frequency, and the abuse of metaphor. The concept of vibration occupies a peculiar and powerful place in contemporary spiritual and liberal discourse because it appears to bridge science and mysticism while in practice belonging fully to neither. Its appeal lies in its ambiguity. Vibration sounds technical, measurable, and universal, yet it is almost never used with any reference to actual physical systems, empirical definitions, or contextual constraints. Instead, it functions as a symbolic shorthand, a moralized metaphor that has been gradually mistaken for an objective description of reality. This slippage from metaphor into dogma is not accidental, nor is it benign. Historically, the language of vibration entered spiritual discourse through 19th and early 20th century metaphysical and esoteric traditions that sought legitimacy by borrowing the vocabulary of emerging sciences. In these traditions, vibration was never meant to describe literal electromagnetic or mechanical oscillations. It was a symbolic way of talking about states of consciousness, moral refinement, or proximity to the divine. The metaphor worked because it evoked motion, resonance, and connection, but it remained, at least initially, a poetic device rather than a claim about physics. Over time, however, the metaphor hardened. As scientific authority became increasingly central to cultural legitimacy, spiritual language that could gesture towards science without being accountable to it gained power. Vibration became detached from its metaphorical roots and repurposed as a quasi-objective metric of human value. Emotional states, beliefs, even people themselves were described as having higher or lower vibrations, with higher implicitly meaning better, safer, purer, and more evolved. What had once been a symbolic way of describing inner experience became a ranking system. This transformation represents a profound category error. In physics, frequency and wavelength describe patterns of motion within specific systems, governed by precise relationships and constraints. High frequency does not mean good, and low frequency does not mean bad. Long wavelengths are not inferior to short ones, they simply behave differently, interact differently with matter, penetrate differently, dissipate differently. In many physical contexts, long wavelengths are more stable, more penetrating, and less easily disrupted than short ones. Moreover, an exclusive emphasis on high frequency misunderstands movement itself. Higher frequency states involve shorter wavelengths and faster oscillations, which can create intensity, brightness, and rapid change, but when sustained become agitating, fragmenting, and energetically static in their own way. They cycle so quickly that there is little opportunity for signals to travel, settle, or be integrated. Higher frequency states involve shorter wavelengths and faster oscillations, which can create intensity, brightness, and rapid change. When these states are reached gradually, resourced adequately, and integrated with grounding and rest, they can be expansive and life-giving. When they are enforced, rushed, or disconnected from slower cycles of integration, they become agitating and fragmenting, producing a kind of energetic stasis in which movement occurs without completion. Slower, lower-frequency states involve longer wavelengths, wider arcs of motion, and greater depth of contact with material systems. They move through bodies, tissues, and environments more fully, allowing for processing, grounding, and repair. From this perspective, the cultural demand to remain in a constant, high vibration, reflects not expansion but a fear of descent, gravity, and completion. It mistakes continuous excitation for growth and overlooks the fact that real healing, reorganization, and embodied awareness require long, slow waveforms that can be felt, metabolized, and lived through over time. None of this maps cleanly onto human emotion or morality, and attempting to force the analogy produces nonsense. In biology and neuroscience, the misuse becomes even clearer. Human nervous systems operate across a wide range of states, from high arousal to deep rest, from mobilization to shutdown. These states are not hierarchical in a moral sense, they are situational. High arousal may be adaptive in moments of threat, creativity, or social engagement, but destructive if sustained. Low arousal may be essential for healing, integration, and restoration, but dangerous if prolonged without support. Slowness, heaviness, withdrawal, and stillness are not failures of vibration, they are integral phases of biological regulation. Yet in contemporary spiritual culture, these distinctions are erased. The metaphor of vibration is flattened into a single axis, with high equated to desirable emotional states such as joy, enthusiasm, optimism, and calm, and low equated to grief, anger, fear, fatigue, and despair. This flattening does not merely oversimplify reality, it actively trains people to misinterpret their own embodied signals. When grief is labeled low vibration, people learn to bypass mourning rather than metabolize loss. When anger is labeled low vibration, people learn to suppress boundary awareness rather than address violation. When exhaustion is labeled low vibration, people learn to override bodily limits rather than rest. The abusive nature of this metaphor emerges most clearly when it is used socially rather than privately. To say, "I feel low," is a subjective report. To say, "You are low vibration," is a judgment. It shifts the frame from experience to identity, from context to essence. Once this shift occurs, the metaphor becomes a tool of sorting and exclusion. People who are struggling are no longer simply struggling, they are contaminating the energetic field. Their presence is framed as a threat to the group's coherence, progress, or safety. This framing allows communities to practice exclusion without confronting its ethical implications. If someone is removed because they are low vibe, the removal can be justified as self-care rather than abandonment. Responsibility is displaced from the group onto the individual's supposed energetic deficiency. The group remains pure, aligned, and positive, while the expelled person is framed as responsible for their own isolation. This is not healing, it is aesthetic hygiene. The metaphor also functions as a powerful cognitive shortcut that discourages inquiry. If discomfort can be dismissed as low vibration, there is no need to ask what it signifies. If dissent can be dismissed as misalignment, there is no need to engage with its content. If suffering can be dismissed as energetic failure, there is no need to examine the conditions producing it. In this way, the language of vibration becomes a mechanism for shutting down thought while appearing spiritually sophisticated. The harm intensifies when this framework intersects with disability, chronic illness, trauma, and marginalization. Many people live in bodies that experience pain, fatigue, dysregulation, or sensory overload as a baseline reality. These states are not transient moods that can be shifted through intention, they are ongoing conditions shaped by biology, environment, and history. When vibration language dominates a community, these individuals are implicitly told that their bodies themselves are out of alignment. Belonging becomes contingent on masking, self-erasure, or silence. Inclusion is offered only to those who can perform lightness, resilience, and ease. There is also a deeper epistemic harm. By privileging certain emotional tones as indicators of truth, the vibration framework teaches people to trust feeling good states over accurate ones. Pleasant ideas are assumed to be true, while uncomfortable ideas are assumed to be false or harmful. This reverses the basic logic of inquiry. Many truths are disturbing, destabilizing, or grief-inducing, especially truths about injustice, exploitation, or collective harm. A framework that equates truth with comfort systematically filters out precisely the information required for meaningful change. Over time, this produces a culture that is emotionally brittle and intellectually shallow. Because unpleasant states are framed as failures, people avoid the slow, heavy, uncertain processes through which insight often emerges. Reflection is replaced by affirmation. Dialogue is replaced by resonance. Complexity is replaced by vibe checks. The metaphor of vibration, once a poetic gesture toward interconnectedness, becomes a barrier to it. What makes this particularly insidious is that it presents itself as benevolent. The language is soft, the intentions often sincere, the desire for harmony genuine. Yet harmony enforced through denial is not harmony, it is suppression. A system that cannot tolerate dissonance cannot adapt, cannot learn, and cannot respond to reality when reality becomes difficult. It can only fracture or collapse. In this sense, the abuse of the vibration metaphor is not a superficial linguistic issue. It is a cognitive and moral restructuring that trains people to confuse comfort with wisdom, conformity with alignment, and exclusion with self-care. It closes the door on depth while insisting it has opened the door to enlightenment. And in doing so, it ensures that movements once oriented toward liberation become increasingly incapable of perceiving the conditions that constrain them. The pathologizing of the human condition and the denial of biological reality. One of the most damaging developments in contemporary spiritual and liberal cultures is the steady reclassification of ordinary, biologically intelligible human responses as signs of pathology, moral failure, or personal deficiency. States that were once recognized as normal reactions to stress, deprivation, threat, loss, or overwhelm are now increasingly framed as evidence that something is wrong with the individual, rather than as signals that something is wrong with the conditions they are navigating. This shift represents not an advance in understanding, but a retreat from it, a collective refusal to reckon with what human nervous systems actually are and how they function. Human biology is not optimized for constant calm, positivity, or coherence. The nervous system evolved to respond dynamically to changing environments, often prioritizing survival over comfort, accuracy, or social harmony. Stress responses such as fight, flight, freeze, and collapse are not malfunctions, they are ancient, deeply conserved adaptations designed to keep organisms alive under threat. When danger is acute or chronic, these responses do not politely switch off. They persist, generalize, and reshape perception, behavior, and emotion. This is not pathology, it is physiology. From a biological perspective, health is not defined by remaining in a single state, but by the capacity to move through states as conditions change. Human nervous systems are designed for rhythmic fluctuation between activation and rest, engagement and withdrawal, expression and consolidation. States of slowness, heaviness, inward focus, and reduced output are not failures of regulation, they are the conditions under which repair, immune function, memory integration, and emotional processing occur. Much of what is labeled as low in contemporary discourse corresponds to these slower, longer cycle processes that allow the body to metabolize experience rather than remain in perpetual readiness. In contrast, sustained high activation, often misnamed as high vibration, high functioning, or optimal regulation, can be biologically destabilizing when it becomes the default rather than a situational response. Faster, high arousal states involve shorter cycles of activation that are useful for action, alertness, and social performance, but costly when prolonged. When cultures valorize constant positivity, coherence, or energetic elevation, they inadvertently promote a static form of overactivation that leaves little room for integration. The body is kept signaling without being allowed to complete the signal. In this way, the cultural preference for high states reverses biological logic, mistaking continuous excitation for health and mistaking the slower waveforms of healing and grounding for dysfunction. Yet modern discourse increasingly treats these responses as aberrations. Anxiety is framed as a thinking problem rather than a threat detection system under strain. Depression is framed as a mindset failure rather than an energy conservation response to prolonged loss or futility. Anger is framed as toxicity rather than a boundary signal. Dissociation is framed as avoidance rather than a last resort survival strategy. In each case, biology is displaced by moral interpretation. The question shifts from, "What happened to you?" or, "What conditions are you in?" to, "Why are you like this?" This reframing is particularly striking given how much neuroscience and psychophysiology have revealed over the last several decades. We now understand that cognition is not primary, that the body often reacts before conscious thought, that perception itself is shaped by prior experience and physiological state. Trauma research has shown that memory, attention, and emotion are reorganized by overwhelming experiences, often in ways that are not accessible to conscious control. Chronic stress reshapes hormonal systems, immune function, and neural connectivity. None of this aligns with the cultural insistence that individuals should simply regulate better, think differently, or choose a higher state. Nevertheless, contemporary spiritual and liberal spaces often behave as though biology were an inconvenience to be overcome rather than a reality to be respected. There is an implicit belief that sufficient awareness, insight, or intention should allow one to transcend nervous system constraints. When people fail to do so, they are subtly or explicitly blamed. They are described as unhealed, dysregulated, resistant, or unwilling to do the work. The burden is placed squarely on the individual, even when the conditions producing their distress remain unchanged or unacknowledged. This denial of biology serves an important social function. By locating dysfunction within individuals rather than environments, communities absolve themselves of responsibility. They do not have to address scarcity, exploitation, inaccessibility, or exclusion if suffering can be explained as a personal failure of regulation or growth. They do not have to slow down, provide accommodation, or tolerate disruption if those who struggle can be framed as pathological. Biology becomes inconvenient because it demands care, patience, and structural change, rather than affirmation and rhetoric. The language used to accomplish this pathologization often borrows selectively from psychology while stripping away context. Clinical terms are abstracted into moral categories. Concepts like regulation, attachment, trauma, and boundaries are removed from their scientific grounding and turned into tools for social sorting. Someone who reacts strongly is labeled dysregulated rather than understood as overwhelmed. Someone who cannot comply with group norms is labeled unsafe rather than accommodated. Someone who expresses pain repeatedly is labeled draining rather than recognized as unsupported. This process is especially violent toward disabled, chronically ill, neurodivergent, and traumatized people because their nervous systems often operate outside narrow cultural expectations. Pain, fatigue, sensory sensitivity, executive dysfunction, emotional volatility, or slowed processing are not character flaws, they are features of particular bodies and brains. When communities treat these features as evidence of being too much, not ready, or not aligned, they are not practicing discernment. They are practicing exclusion under the guise of wellness. There is also a profound contradiction at the heart of this pathologizing impulse. Many of the same spaces that reject biological explanations when it comes to suffering eagerly invoke biology when it supports their moral narratives. Neuroscience is cited when it validates mindfulness, positivity, or regulation, but ignored when it complicates those ideals. Evolution is invoked to justify self-optimization, but dismissed when it explains anger, fear, or withdrawal. Biology is selectively acknowledged only when it reinforces the preferred image of a calm, compliant, high-functioning subject. This selective engagement reveals that the issue is not ignorance but discomfort. Fully facing biological reality would require acknowledging that many people cannot simply choose their way out of distress, that healing often requires changes in environment, resources, and relationships, not just insight or effort. It would require accepting that some forms of suffering are rational responses to unjust conditions, not signs of personal failure. It would require confronting the limits of individualism and the moral inadequacy of cultures that prioritize harmony over care. The pathologizing of the human condition also narrows the range of acceptable narratives about struggle. People are encouraged to frame their pain as lessons, growth opportunities, or stepping stones toward enlightenment. While meaning-making can be valuable, its compulsory use becomes coercive. Not all suffering has an immediate lesson. Not all pain leads to growth. Sometimes suffering simply reflects deprivation, harm, or loss, and insisting otherwise functions to invalidate lived reality. Biology does not guarantee redemption narratives, it guarantees response to conditions. Over time, this denial of biological truth produces communities that are profoundly disconnected from embodiment. People learn to distrust their own sensations, to override exhaustion, to suppress distress, to reinterpret warning signals as spiritual or psychological shortcomings. This disconnection may look like strength or resilience on the surface, but it is often brittle, maintained through constant self-monitoring and self-correction. When the body eventually asserts itself, as it inevitably does, the collapse is framed as personal failure rather than systemic neglect. At its core, the pathologization of the human condition is a refusal to accept vulnerability as intrinsic to life. It is an attempt to build cultures around the fantasy of control, coherence, and upward trajectory, rather than around the realities of fluctuation, dependency, and limitation. In doing so, it transforms ordinary human variation into deviance and turns communities that claim to heal into environments that quietly harm. By rejecting biology, these cultures do not become more enlightened. They become less grounded, less compassionate, and less capable of responding to the world as it actually is. They replace understanding with judgment, care with categorization, and solidarity with sorting. And in that substitution, they lose the very humanity they claim to protect. Manifestation, positivity, and the collapse of physical reality into thought. A central pillar of contemporary New Age and adjacent liberal spiritual discourse is the insistence that belief, intention, and emotional orientation are primary forces shaping reality, often summarized through phrases like, "Thoughts create reality, what you focus on expands," or, "Your beliefs manifest your life." These ideas are usually presented as empowering, encouraging individuals to recognize their agency and to take responsibility for their inner world. Yet beneath this surface appeal lies a profound conceptual confusion, one that collapses fundamentally different domains of reality into a single explanatory frame and, in doing so, erases the limits imposed by physical existence. Human experience unfolds across multiple layers that interact but are not interchangeable. There is subjective reality, composed of thoughts, emotions, interpretations, memories, and meanings. There is relational reality, shaped by social dynamics, power, history, and access to resources. And there is physical reality, governed by material conditions, biological constraints, energy availability, and the laws of physics. Manifestation discourse routinely treats these layers as if they were the same plane, as though a shift in thought or feeling could directly override physical conditions without mediation, friction, or cost. This conflation is often disguised through vague metaphors drawn from physics or metaphysics, references to energy, vibration, fields, or dimensions that suggest continuity between mind and matter without ever specifying mechanisms. In some versions, thought is described as operating on a subtler plane, sometimes likened to plasma, etheric or energetic dimensions, which then supposedly reorganize the physical world beneath them. While such metaphors may be meaningful within symbolic or contemplative frameworks, they are routinely treated as literal causal explanations, despite lacking empirical grounding or internal coherence. The problem is not that inner states influence behavior. They do. Beliefs shape perception, perception shapes action, and action can alter outcomes within the bounds of what is physically possible. Optimism may increase persistence, confidence may affect social interaction, and expectation can influence motivation. But this is a mediated process, constrained by environment, resources, and biology. To suggest that belief alone can reorganize material reality without regard to those constraints is to mistake correlation for causation and metaphor for mechanism. This mistake becomes particularly harmful when manifestation ideology is applied to situations involving illness, disability, poverty, violence, or systemic oppression. When physical limitations are treated as reflections of mindset, people are implicitly blamed for conditions they did not choose and cannot simply think their way out of. A body that cannot heal, a nervous system that cannot regulate, a life constrained by economic scarcity or discrimination becomes evidence not of reality's limits but of insufficient belief, insufficient positivity, insufficient alignment. This is not empowerment. It is moralized denial. At the heart of this denial is a refusal to acknowledge that physical reality operates according to different rules than emotional or symbolic reality. Bodies require energy, rest, nutrients, and safety. Cells repair at finite rates. Nervous systems fatigue. Infrastructure breaks down. Social systems distribute resources unevenly. No amount of belief can alter these facts directly. At best, belief can influence how one navigates within them. To erase this distinction is to set people up for failure and shame when reality does not comply. The confusion deepens when emotional states are treated as proof of physical causation. Feeling hopeful is taken as evidence that things will improve. Feeling despair is taken as evidence that things will worsen. Yet emotions are responses to perception, not reliable predictors of material outcomes. One can feel positive and still become ill, poor, or injured. One can feel hopeless and still survive, adapt, or even thrive due to external intervention or sheer contingency. Emotional reality and physical reality interact, but they are not mirrors of one another. By collapsing these domains, manifestation culture trains people to monitor and police their inner states as though those states were levers controlling the external world. Fear becomes dangerous not because it signals threat, but because it is believed to attract harm. Grief becomes risky not because it is painful, but because it is believed to lower vibration and block abundance. Anger becomes taboo not because it can be destructive, but because it is believed to interfere with manifestation. In this way, inner life becomes a site of constant surveillance, driven by the fear that the wrong feeling will produce the wrong reality. What this framework fundamentally misunderstands is that internal states are not switches that turn outcomes on or off, but phases within longer biological and experiential cycles. Slower, denser, inward-turning states often labeled as low, heavy, or regressive are not signs that manifestation has failed. They are the states through which experience is processed, meaning is integrated, and the body recalibrates to reality. Sorrow releases accumulated strain and restores perspective. Stillness allows signals to complete. Grounded attention reconnects people to physical limits, needs, and timing. Without access to these slower states, inner work becomes shallow and repetitive, trapped in surface-level adjustment rather than deep reorganization. By contrast, the demand for continuous positivity and forward-oriented focus often produces a form of psychological and physiological stasis. High arousal states involve rapid cycles of activation that are useful for motivation and action, but when treated as a permanent requirement, they prevent completion. Nothing is allowed to settle. Nothing is allowed to descend. The system remains perpetually up, alert, and self-monitoring, mistaking this constant excitation for momentum. In reality, meaningful change, whether emotional, biological, or material, depends on long, slow waveforms that move through the body and life over time. Manifestation ideology interrupts these processes by treating descent, pause, and gravity as threats rather than as the conditions under which real healing and adaptation occur. This surveillance has predictable social effects. People experiencing genuine hardship are pressured to remain positive for fear of making things worse. They are encouraged to reinterpret loss as a mindset challenge rather than a material event. When outcomes do not improve, the failure is internalized. The ideology is protected from falsification because any negative result can be attributed to insufficient belief, while any positive result is claimed as proof of the system's validity. Physical reality is never allowed to speak for itself. There is also a quieter, more insidious consequence. By framing reality as something that can and should be controlled through thought, manifestation ideology undermines the capacity to grieve, accept limits, and respond appropriately to irreversible loss. Some things cannot be fixed. Some bodies will not recover. Some systems will not reform in time. To insist otherwise is not hope, it is refusal. And refusal, when imposed socially, becomes cruelty. This framework also dovetails seamlessly with individualistic ideologies that benefit from minimizing structural responsibility. If reality is primarily shaped by belief, then social inequities become personal failures of imagination. Poverty becomes a scarcity mindset. Illness becomes a manifestation block. Marginalization becomes a vibrational mismatch. The need for collective action, redistribution, and structural change dissolves into a series of personal mindset adjustments. Physical reality is rendered invisible precisely where it is most oppressive. None of this requires rejecting meaning-making, intention, or the value of inner work. It requires restoring boundaries between domains that have been irresponsibly collapsed. Thought is powerful, but it is not omnipotent. Emotion is informative, but it is not causative in the way matter is. Symbolic frameworks can guide behavior, but they cannot override biology or physics. When these distinctions are honored, people can engage inner life as a resource rather than a battleground, and hope can coexist with realism rather than replacing it. A culture that refuses to distinguish between mental, emotional, and physical reality does not become more empowered. It becomes more confused, more punitive, and more detached from the conditions that actually shape human lives. In such a culture, positivity is not a source of resilience but a demand, belief is not a tool but a test, and manifestation is not a metaphor but a mandate. And those whose lives do not conform to the mandate are left carrying not only their material burdens, but the added weight of moral blame. Short-form cognition and the collapse of depth. One of the most decisive yet least examined transformations shaping contemporary consciousness is the shift from long-form cognition to short-form cognition, a shift that alters not only how information is consumed but how meaning itself is constructed. This change is often framed as a neutral evolution in communication style, a simple adaptation to new technologies or faster lives, but its effects are neither neutral nor superficial. Short-form cognition restructures attention, compresses complexity, and trains people to relate to ideas as consumable units rather than as processes requiring time, integration, and endurance. Human understanding has historically depended on sustained engagement. Philosophical arguments, spiritual teachings, political visions, and scientific theories were developed through extended narratives, layered reasoning, and iterative refinement. Long-form thought allowed contradictions to coexist, permitted uncertainty to remain unresolved, and created space for insight to emerge gradually rather than instantaneously. Depth was not an aesthetic choice, it was a cognitive necessity. Many truths cannot be apprehended quickly because they require the nervous system to tolerate ambiguity, emotional discomfort, and the slow accumulation of context. Cognition itself is not instantaneous, it unfolds through time, rhythm, and repetition. Deep understanding requires long, slow cycles of attention in which information can move through the body, settle into memory, and reorganize existing frameworks. These processes depend on lower frequency, longer duration states of engagement that allow for digestion rather than reaction. Insight often arrives not as a flash, but as a gradual shift in orientation that can only occur when the system is allowed to remain with material long enough for it to be metabolized. Short-form cognition disrupts these processes by training attention into rapid, high-frequency sampling. Ideas are encountered briefly, reacted to immediately, and then replaced before they can complete a full cognitive or emotional cycle. This produces a state that feels active and informed but is, in practice, static. Information is encountered without sufficient time for descent, consolidation, or integration. The system remains highly active, but rarely completes a full cycle of transformation, mistaking continuous engagement for depth. Nothing is allowed to descend, deepen, or integrate. The system remains perpetually stimulated but rarely transformed. In this sense, short-form cognition mirrors the cultural fixation on constant, high vibration. It privileges speed, brightness, and immediacy while systematically undermining the slower waveforms through which depth, grounding, and genuine understanding emerge. Short-form cognition operates on entirely different principles. It privileges immediacy, emotional salience, and rapid resolution. Ideas are stripped of context so they can be grasped instantly. Nuance is treated as excess. Ambiguity is treated as failure. Meaning is conveyed through slogans, fragments, and images designed to trigger recognition rather than reflection. This mode of cognition is not inherently evil, but it is inherently limited. It excels at signaling, alerting, and mobilizing, but it is profoundly ill-suited for understanding systems, histories, or lived realities that unfold over time. The dominance of short-form cognition is not the result of collective preference alone, it is structurally incentivized. Digital platforms are designed around attention extraction, and attention is most easily captured through novelty, emotional intensity, and speed. Content that can be consumed quickly and reacted to immediately is rewarded with visibility, while content that demands sustained focus is algorithmically disadvantaged. Over time, these incentives shape not only what people see but what they expect to see, and eventually what they are capable of engaging with without distress. As short-form cognition becomes normalized, long-form thought begins to feel unfamiliar, then uncomfortable, then suspicious. People experience sustained arguments as exhausting rather than nourishing. Complex explanations are perceived as evasive. Historical context is dismissed as overthinking. The capacity to hold multiple variables in mind at once diminishes, replaced by a preference for binary framing and moral clarity. This is not because people become unintelligent, but because their cognitive environment no longer supports the development or maintenance of depth. The consequences of this shift are especially severe in spiritual and liberal spaces that claim to value awareness, growth, and liberation. Many of the issues these movements seek to address, such as systemic injustice, trauma, embodiment, or consciousness itself, are inherently complex and resistant to simplification. They require slow inquiry, contested interpretation, and the willingness to sit with unresolved tension. When these subjects are forced into short-form containers, they become caricatures of themselves. Liberation becomes a slogan. Healing becomes a checklist. Justice becomes a performance. Short-form cognition also reshapes moral reasoning. Instead of ethics emerging from deliberation, context, and competing values, moral judgments are increasingly made through pattern recognition. Certain phrases signal goodness, others signal danger. Certain emotional tones signal safety, others signal threat. This allows for rapid social sorting but undermines ethical discernment. People learn to respond to cues rather than to reason, to react rather than to understand. Moral life becomes reflexive rather than reflective. This reflexivity is particularly dangerous because it creates the illusion of certainty. Short-form cognition rewards confidence and punishes hesitation. Those who speak quickly and decisively are perceived as more credible than those who pause, qualify, or revise their statements. Yet genuine understanding often requires precisely those qualities that short-form culture discourages: slowness, revision, humility, and doubt. As a result, those most willing to oversimplify often dominate discourse, while those most capable of depth withdraw or are ignored. The collapse of depth also erodes the ability to reprogram one's own thinking in any meaningful sense. Deep change, whether psychological, spiritual, or political, requires sustained engagement with one's own assumptions, contradictions, and defenses. It requires time for insight to destabilize existing frameworks and for new ones to cohere. Short-form cognition interrupts this process constantly. Before an idea can take root, it is displaced by the next stimulus. Reflection is replaced by consumption. Transformation is replaced by affirmation. This environment is particularly hostile to people whose lives demand slower processing, whether due to disability, trauma, illness, or simply a different cognitive style. Long-form thinkers are often misread as pedantic, difficult, or unsafe. Those who need time to articulate themselves are outpaced and sidelined. The culture implicitly favors those who can compress themselves into digestible fragments, even if that compression distorts their meaning. Inclusion becomes contingent on cognitive speed rather than depth of insight. There is also a political consequence. Revolutionary ideas rarely emerge fully formed. They develop through extended critique, dialogue, failure, and revision. They require communities capable of holding disagreement without collapse and complexity without panic. Short-form cognition undermines these capacities. It fragments collective attention, turning potential movements into swarms of reaction rather than sustained forces for change. It favors symbolic victories over material ones, visibility over effectiveness, and consensus over truth. In this context, conformity does not need to be enforced overtly. It emerges organically from the constraints of the medium. People internalize the rules of engagement, adjusting their thoughts and expressions to fit what will be received, shared, and approved. Over time, they stop thinking thoughts that cannot be easily expressed. Depth withers not because it is forbidden, but because it is unsupported. The tragedy of this collapse is that it masquerades as accessibility. Short-form content is often defended as more inclusive, more democratic, more approachable. In reality, it often excludes precisely those who cannot reduce their experience to sound bites and those whose realities resist simplification. Accessibility without depth is not liberation, it is flattening. True accessibility would expand cognitive capacity, not shrink it. A culture dominated by short-form cognition becomes increasingly vulnerable to manipulation because it lacks the tools to detect it. Without context, history, and sustained reasoning, people are left with impressions rather than understanding. They become easier to polarize, easier to distract, and easier to govern through emotion rather than argument. In such a culture, the appearance of consensus can be manufactured quickly, while the substance of agreement remains shallow and unstable. The collapse of depth, then, is not merely an intellectual loss. It is a loss of agency. When people cannot think slowly, they cannot resist effectively. When they cannot hold complexity, they cannot envision alternatives. When they cannot tolerate uncertainty, they cling to certainty wherever it is offered. And when they are trained to consume meaning rather than generate it, liberation becomes something they watch rather than something they build. Divide and conquer through moral fragmentation. One of the most effective ways power has historically neutralized collective resistance is not through overt repression, but through fragmentation. When people are divided against one another along moral, emotional, or identity-based lines, their attention is redirected away from shared material conditions and toward constant internal surveillance. Contemporary spiritual and liberal belief systems, despite their stated commitments to justice and compassion, increasingly function in exactly this way. Rather than confronting economic exploitation, institutional power, resource hoarding, and systemic discrimination, communities become absorbed in monitoring tone, wording, emotional presentation, and symbolic alignment. This redirection operates subtly. Instead of asking who benefits from precarity, people are encouraged to ask who used the wrong language. Instead of interrogating why resources are scarce, attention is focused on whether someone's emotional state is regulated. Instead of building solidarity across difference, communities fracture into micro-factions defined by moral purity, ideological fluency, and aesthetic coherence. Conflict becomes horizontal, interpersonal, and endless, while structural forces remain largely untouched. This fragmentation is reinforced by the regulation of acceptable emotional tempo. Communities implicitly reward states that are fast, fluent, upbeat, and easily signaled, while penalizing states that are slower, heavier, or require time to process. Grief that lingers, anger that does not resolve quickly, fatigue that limits participation, or reflection that resists immediate clarity all disrupt the preferred pace of discourse. Rather than being recognized as grounded or reality-based responses, these states are treated as obstacles to cohesion. In this way, emotional speed becomes a proxy for moral standing. The result is not simply division, but synchronization around a narrow band of acceptable states. Collective life is tuned toward constant responsiveness and surface harmony, leaving little room for the slower waveforms through which solidarity is built, shared endurance, long-term commitment, and the capacity to remain present with unresolved conditions. Those who cannot match the dominant frequency are not argued with, they are filtered out. Fragmentation thus occurs not only through disagreement, but through enforced tempo, ensuring that only those who can move quickly, lightly, and optimistically remain visible. Moral fragmentation works because it feels ethical. People believe they are protecting safety, healing, or community integrity, when in fact they are participating in a system that isolates individuals and dissolves collective power. Disagreement is no longer treated as a necessary component of democratic or spiritual life, but as evidence of harm. Dissent is reframed as danger. Complexity becomes suspect. The result is not resolution, but perpetual low-level conflict that exhausts participants and prevents sustained collective action. This environment is especially punishing for marginalized and disabled people. Those whose bodies, nervous systems, or life circumstances make constant positivity impossible are quickly identified as problems. They disrupt the aesthetic of progress and wellness that communities wish to project. They require material support, accommodation, patience, and structural change, not affirmations or slogans. Because they cannot perform resilience on demand, they are framed as draining, unsafe, or misaligned. Their exclusion is rarely named as such. It is justified through language of boundaries, energy protection, or community care. Exile thus becomes normalized while compassion is still claimed. People are removed not for causing harm, but for embodying reality too visibly. Poverty, illness, grief, and rage are treated as moral inconveniences rather than collective responsibilities. This allows communities to maintain a self-image of goodness while quietly shedding those who challenge its coherence. Solidarity collapses not because people don't care, but because care has been redefined in ways that exclude those who need it most. The political consequence of this fragmentation is profound. When communities are consumed by internal moral policing, they lose the capacity to confront power. Attention is diverted inward and sideways, never upward. Structural injustice becomes background noise, while interpersonal missteps dominate discourse. This is not accidental. A divided population is easier to manage than a united one, and moral fragmentation achieves division without requiring overt coercion. In this sense, contemporary conformity culture functions as a classic divide-and-conquer system adapted to psychological and spiritual language. It does not tell people what to think, but it trains them where to look. It keeps them busy adjudicating one another's worth while the conditions shaping their lives remain largely intact. Liberation movements that cannot recognize this dynamic risk becoming instruments of stabilization rather than change, enforcing order horizontally while power consolidates vertically. Psychological language as governance. Psychology was never intended to function as a moral court. Its tools were developed to understand suffering, alleviate distress, and support human functioning within specific clinical contexts. Yet over time, psychological language has escaped those contexts and become a governing framework for social life. Concepts designed for healing have been repurposed to regulate behavior, adjudicate conflict, and determine belonging, often without the safeguards, nuance, or accountability that clinical use requires. In contemporary spiritual and liberal spaces, therapeutic terms are routinely used to shut down debate rather than to deepen understanding. Statements are labeled harmful without explanation. Disagreement is reframed as lack of awareness. Emotional responses are diagnosed rather than engaged. This language carries authority because it borrows from science and care, but it is applied without empirical rigor or ethical restraint. What emerges is not therapy, but governance by vocabulary. Moral rank is quietly assigned through psychological labels. To be regulated, healed, or self-aware is to be seen as trustworthy and evolved. To be dysregulated, triggered, or unhealed is to be seen as suspect. These categories are rarely defined clearly, yet they function powerfully to sort people into insiders and outsiders. Because the criteria are subjective and shifting, individuals are left in a constant state of self-monitoring, attempting to present the correct emotional and cognitive posture in order to remain acceptable. This constant self-monitoring is not merely cognitive, it is physiological. People are pressured to maintain a narrow band of acceptable emotional tone, calm, measured, coherent, forward-facing regardless of what their bodies are actually experiencing. Slower states that involve processing, fatigue, grief, confusion, or sensory overwhelm are treated as evidence of insufficient regulation rather than as signals of reality. Psychological language thus becomes a mechanism for enforcing a preferred internal tempo, privileging states that are quick to articulate and easy to contain while marginalizing those that require time, depth, or accommodation. Over time, this produces a form of internalized governance in which individuals learn to override their own nervous systems in order to remain legible. The goal shifts from healing to presentation, from integration to compliance. Rather than moving through states organically, people attempt to stabilize themselves permanently in a narrow range of acceptable effect. This is not regulation in a biological sense, it is constraint. The longer-term result is fragmentation, burnout, and loss of self-trust, as the body's slower waveforms of repair and meaning-making are repeatedly interrupted in the name of psychological correctness. This language also provides a convenient justification for exclusion. Boundaries, originally meant to describe limits one sets on one's own behavior, are reinterpreted as grounds for banishment. "I can't hold space," becomes a socially acceptable way to withdraw from responsibility. Accountability, once associated with repair, dialogue, and restitution, is redefined as punishment without process. There is no path back, no mechanism for growth, only a verdict. This is not accountability. It is social sentencing. Crucially, this system allows harm to be enacted without being named as such. Because the language is therapeutic, exclusion can be framed as self-care, refusal as safety, and abandonment as wisdom. Those on the receiving end are left without recourse, as any protest can be interpreted as further evidence of dysregulation or lack of insight. Power becomes diffuse and unaccountable, exercised through consensus rather than authority, yet no less coercive for it. This form of governance is particularly damaging to those whose lives involve chronic stress, trauma, disability, or material precarity. Nervous systems shaped by real threat do not perform calm on command. Bodies in pain do not communicate neatly. People under strain do not always express themselves gently. When psychological language is used as a moral filter, these realities are treated as failures rather than facts. Care is withheld precisely where it is most needed. What results is a soft authoritarianism wearing a wellness costume. There are no laws, no police, no explicit punishments, yet behavior is tightly regulated through fear of moral condemnation and social death. People learn to self-censor not only their speech, but their inner experience. They shape themselves to fit the language rather than shaping language to fit reality. This is governance without transparency, power without responsibility. A culture that confuses therapy with justice and diagnosis with discernment cannot remain humane. Healing tools cannot function as universal moral instruments without becoming weapons. When psychological language replaces ethical reasoning, relational repair, and material responsibility, it stops serving human flourishing and starts enforcing conformity. Recognizing this is not an attack on psychology. It is a defense of it. Historical lineage, how thought, emotion, and belief were gradually conditioned into instruments of conformity. The story begins long before the terms, New Age, liberal, or woke, existed, at a moment when Western societies were undergoing simultaneous crises of religion, authority, and meaning. In the mid to late 19th century, industrialization, scientific advancement, and urbanization eroded the credibility of traditional religious institutions for many people, while offering no coherent replacement for moral or existential grounding. Into this vacuum emerged a constellation of metaphysical movements that attempted to reconcile spirituality with modernity by internalizing divinity and moral causality. Among the most influential of these was New Thought, a loosely organized American movement that proposed that mind, belief, and attitude were not merely influences on life but primary causal forces shaping health, success, and reality itself. New Thought was not a fringe oddity, it was deeply embedded in middle-class American culture and education, particularly among Protestant reformers, early psychologists, and self-improvement writers. It drew on transcendentalism, Christian metaphysics, and early interpretations of psychology, promoting the idea that right thinking produced right outcomes and that suffering reflected errors in belief. This framework quietly introduced two ideas that would prove decisive later: first, that internal states could be morally evaluated as correct or incorrect, and second, that external conditions could be explained without reference to structural forces, power, or material constraints. What also entered at this point, though less explicitly named, was a shift in how human rhythm was understood. Internal states were no longer treated as phases within longer biological, emotional, and social cycles, but as positions one ought to occupy consistently. Slowness, gravity, sorrow, uncertainty, and descent states historically associated with processing, mourning, consolidation, and wisdom began to be reframed as errors to be corrected rather than movements to be completed. The human organism was subtly recast as something that should remain oriented toward uplift, clarity, and forward motion, rather than oscillating organically between activation and rest. Over time, this laid the groundwork for a culture that increasingly mistrusts long waveforms. States that take time, that move slowly through bodies and communities, that require patience rather than resolution, became harder to justify within systems oriented toward improvement, optimization, and control. What was lost was not merely tolerance for discomfort, but respect for the temporal structure of healing, learning, and adaptation themselves. This loss would later be amplified by psychology, persuasion science, and digital platforms, each reinforcing the idea that faster, lighter, more immediately legible states were not just preferable, but more advanced. Parallel to this development, European esoteric traditions such as Theosophy, founded by Helena Blavatsky and supported by a network of educated elites, introduced a hierarchical cosmology framed in the language of vibration, planes, and evolutionary ascent. These ideas were not meant as physics, but they borrowed scientific vocabulary to gain authority, presenting spiritual development as movement toward higher frequencies and subtler forms. Crucially, Theosophy framed spiritual progress as evolutionary advancement, a concept that would later be dangerously compatible with social hierarchy, colonial thinking, and moral ranking. While not mainstream, these ideas circulated widely among intellectual, artistic, and political circles, seeding a vocabulary that would later re-emerge stripped of its original context. At the same time, mass persuasion itself was becoming a formal discipline. In the early 20th century, Edward Bernays, trained in psychology and deeply influenced by his uncle Sigmund Freud, pioneered modern public relations. Bernays openly argued that democratic societies required the engineering of consent, that public opinion could and should be shaped by experts, using emotional and symbolic appeals rather than rational debate. His work was not covert, it was celebrated and widely adopted by corporations, governments, and political movements. The significance of Bernays is not that he created propaganda, but that he normalized the idea that belief, emotion, and identity could be systematically managed at scale. By the mid-20th century, this logic extended into both military and civilian research. Behaviorism, most prominently associated with B.F. Skinner, framed human behavior as something that could be shaped through reinforcement and environment rather than inner meaning. While Skinner himself was not a spiritual figure, his work profoundly influenced education, organizational management, advertising, and later digital design. The idea that human beings could be conditioned, nudged, and optimized without engaging their subjective experience became embedded in institutional thinking. During the Cold War, culture itself became explicitly recognized as a strategic domain. The United States, facing ideological competition with the Soviet Union, invested heavily in shaping intellectual and artistic life. One of the most important and well-documented examples of this was the Congress for Cultural Freedom, a network of journals, conferences, and cultural programs covertly funded by the CIA and allied foundations. Its purpose was not to dictate beliefs directly, but to cultivate a cultural environment hostile to Marxism and friendly to liberal democratic individualism. Many of the writers, philosophers, and academics involved were not aware of the funding source, but the effect was real. Certain frameworks were amplified, others marginalized, and liberal individualism was positioned as the only legitimate alternative to totalitarianism. This matters because it normalized the idea that culture could be guided indirectly, through funding, institutions, and prestige rather than overt coercion. After the Cold War, this logic did not disappear, it was absorbed into think tanks, NGOs, philanthropy, and later platform governance. The method outlived the conflict. Meanwhile, psychology was undergoing its own transformation. In the 1950s and 1960s, humanistic psychology emerged as a reaction against behaviorism, emphasizing growth, self-actualization, and personal meaning. Figures like Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers framed psychological health as a process of becoming rather than conformity. This work fed directly into the human potential movement, which sought to integrate psychology, spirituality, and personal transformation. One of the central hubs of this movement was the Esalen Institute, founded by Michael Murphy and others, which brought together psychologists, spiritual teachers, artists, scientists, and, notably, military and intelligence figures interested in consciousness research and non-traditional diplomacy. Esalen did not produce a single ideology, but it created a cross-pollination zone where spiritual language, psychological techniques, and elite institutional interests interacted. Practices developed there filtered outward into therapy culture, leadership training, corporate retreats, and later self-help industries. The emphasis on inner transformation, while often sincere, also reinforced the idea that social change could occur without structural confrontation, through shifts in awareness rather than redistribution or conflict. In the latter half of the 20th century, cognitive psychology rose to prominence, particularly through the work of Aaron T. Beck, whose development of cognitive therapy and later cognitive behavioral therapy reframed mental suffering as the result of distorted thought patterns. Clinically, this approach helped many people, but culturally it introduced a powerful meme, that internal narratives were the primary locus of change. As CBT frameworks were simplified and popularized, they migrated into self-help, coaching, and eventually activist and spiritual spaces, often stripped of their clinical nuance and context. At the same time, the late 20th century saw the rise of positive psychology, spearheaded by figures such as Martin Seligman, which sought to study well-being, optimism, and flourishing. While intended as a corrective to psychology's focus on pathology, positive psychology was quickly embraced by institutions eager for productivity, resilience, and morale without structural change. Schools, workplaces, and governments adopted its language, and positivity began to be framed not just as beneficial, but as a responsibility. These psychological currents converged with the resurgence of manifestation ideology in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, most visibly through mass media events like The Secret and its promotion by influential platforms. Manifestation reframed new thought ideas for a neoliberal era, emphasizing personal responsibility, belief, and emotional alignment while minimizing material constraint. In a context of rising inequality and precarity, this ideology offered hope without challenging power, making it highly compatible with existing economic structures. The final accelerant was technological. With the rise of social media and algorithmic platforms, attention became the primary commodity. Systems optimized for engagement rewarded content that was emotionally charged, easily digestible, and rapidly shareable. Short-form cognition became not just common, but normative. Over time, this technological environment reshaped epistemology itself. Truth became what felt resonant, morality became what could be signaled quickly, and depth became a liability. Within this environment, spiritual and liberal movements underwent a subtle but decisive shift. Language became standardized. Emotional tone became regulated. Psychological concepts became moral judgments. Vibration became hierarchy. Positivity became virtue. Accountability became punishment. Dissent became pathology. None of this required centralized control. It emerged from the alignment of historical ideas, institutional incentives, professionalized activism, platform economics, and cultural fear of instability. What people experience today as a sudden collapse of open-mindedness is not sudden at all. It is the cumulative effect of more than a century of ideas about mind, behavior, persuasion, and progress being gradually detached from context, simplified for mass consumption, and deployed in environments that reward conformity over inquiry. The result is a culture that believes it has transcended dogma while enforcing it more efficiently than many religions ever did. This history does not indict spirituality, psychology, or liberalism as such. It indicts the way they have been abstracted, professionalized, and moralized in service of stability rather than truth. And it explains why so many people now feel that movements once dedicated to liberation have become hostile to depth, embodiment, and difference, not because anyone planned it that way, but because the conditions that shaped them made any other outcome increasingly difficult. What was lost? Original liberalism and original spirituality. What has been lost in the transformation of liberalism and spirituality is not merely a set of beliefs, but an entire orientation toward reality, an orientation that assumed difficulty, conflict, uncertainty, and suffering were not obstacles to truth but the very terrain through which truth had to be reached. Early liberal movements did not promise comfort. They promised exposure. They insisted that inherited authority, tradition, and power be questioned even when doing so was destabilizing, socially costly, or personally dangerous. To be liberal in its original sense was not to belong to a moral community that affirmed one's goodness, but to risk isolation by refusing to accept certainty where none had been earned. Classical liberal thought emerged in opposition to absolutism, religious orthodoxy, and inherited hierarchy, and it did so by foregrounding the capacity for reasoned disagreement. It assumed that no authority, no doctrine, and no consensus was beyond critique. This meant tolerating speech that was offensive, unsettling, or threatening to established norms, not because such speech was always correct, but because the alternative was intellectual stagnation enforced by fear. Liberalism was not built on the assumption that people would feel safe while thinking freely, it was built on the recognition that freedom of thought is often deeply uncomfortable. Early liberal movements also understood that progress was slow, contested, and uneven. Arguments unfolded across books, pamphlets, debates, letters, and speeches that required sustained attention and historical memory. Positions evolved through conflict rather than consensus, and disagreement within movements was not treated as betrayal but as an expected consequence of genuine inquiry. There was no illusion that truth would be immediately legible or universally palatable. The expectation was not harmony, but friction. In contrast, contemporary liberal spaces often behave as though moral clarity should be immediate and total, as though the correct position should be obvious to any decent person, and as though disagreement must therefore signal bad faith, ignorance, or harm. This represents a fundamental inversion. Where original liberalism treated dissent as a safeguard against tyranny, modern liberal culture often treats dissent as a threat to safety. Where original liberalism sought to expand the range of permissible thought, modern liberal culture increasingly narrows it in the name of protection. A similar loss can be traced in the evolution of spirituality. Pre-modern spiritual traditions, across cultures, did not frame the spiritual path as pleasant, affirming, or socially harmonious. They framed it as arduous, destabilizing, and often alienating. Mystics, ascetics, and contemplatives were not celebrated for being agreeable, they were often regarded as troubling, excessive, or even dangerous. Spiritual insight was understood to arise through confrontation with fear, doubt, longing, grief, and the limits of the self. There was no expectation that spiritual depth would make one easy to be around. Traditional spiritual practices emphasize discipline, solitude, and long periods of silence or repetition precisely because transformation was understood to require time. Insight was not something one consumed, it was something one endured. What was implicit in these traditions was an understanding of rhythm. Transformation was assumed to occur through long cycles of attention, repetition, descent, and return. Slowness was not interpreted as failure, but as the necessary condition for integration. States of gravity, sorrow, fatigue, and uncertainty were not interruptions to the path, they were the path. They allowed experience to move through the body and psyche fully, rather than being prematurely resolved or transcended. Depth required time, and time required tolerance for states that could not be made pleasant or efficient. By contrast, contemporary liberal and spiritual cultures increasingly treat these long waveforms as problems to be solved. Anything that cannot be processed quickly, articulated cleanly, or resolved into affirmation is treated as suspect. The result is not transcendence but truncation. Processes that once unfolded through endurance are now expected to yield insight on demand. Grounding is mistaken for stagnation. Descent is mistaken for regression. What is lost is not only depth of understanding, but the body's ability to complete cycles of meaning, grief, repair, and reorientation. Many traditions explicitly warned against premature claims of enlightenment, spiritual pride, or the desire to feel special or superior. The emphasis was on humility before mystery, not mastery over reality. Original spirituality also did not deny the body. Even traditions that sought transcendence understood the body as a site of initiation rather than an inconvenience to be bypassed. Pain, illness, aging, and death were not framed as failures of alignment or belief, but as unavoidable features of embodied existence. Spiritual maturity was measured not by the absence of suffering, but by one's relationship to it, by the capacity to remain present without denial, projection, or moralization. What has replaced these orientations is a sanitized version of both liberalism and spirituality that prioritizes emotional comfort, social belonging, and moral signaling over inquiry, depth, and truth. In this new configuration, the highest good is no longer understanding, but coherence. Communities seek not to discover what is true, but to maintain internal harmony and a shared identity. Discomfort is reframed as harm, difficulty as toxicity, and complexity as danger. This shift has profound consequences for who can participate. Original liberal and spiritual movements were often hostile environments, but they were hostile in ways that challenged power and expanded possibility. Contemporary versions are often hostile in quieter ways, excluding. Those who cannot perform optimism, regulation, or ideological fluency. Disabled people, chronically ill people, traumatized people, and those living under material precarity are no longer seen as bearers of insight born of necessity, they are seen as disruptions to the vibe, reminders of limits that the culture would rather deny. There is also a loss of courage. Earlier movements understood that meaningful change required confronting uncomfortable truths about society, about human nature, and about oneself. They accepted that this confrontation would provoke fear, anger, and resistance, both internally and externally. Modern movements, by contrast, often seek to manage emotion rather than engage reality. They emphasize self-care over sacrifice, regulation over risk, and affirmation over struggle. While care is necessary, its elevation to the primary moral principle often functions to protect people from the very experiences that historically produced insight and solidarity. Perhaps most critically, what has been lost is the capacity to imagine alternatives. Original liberalism and spirituality were generative because they allowed people to think beyond existing frameworks, to entertain heretical ideas, and to remain in uncertainty long enough for something genuinely new to emerge. Contemporary conformity culture, shaped by short-form cognition, moralized emotion, and social surveillance, makes this nearly impossible. People learn to self-censor not only what they say, but what they think, avoiding lines of inquiry that might lead them outside the bounds of acceptability. In losing these capacities, movements have not become safer or more compassionate. They have become narrower, more brittle, and less capable of responding to the realities they claim to address. They have traded depth for accessibility, inquiry for affirmation, and liberation for belonging. And in doing so, they have abandoned the very qualities that once made them transformative. What remains is a hollowed-out version of freedom, one that promises inclusion without difference, growth without pain, and meaning without struggle. It is understandable that such a promise would be attractive in an era of exhaustion and instability. But it is also unsustainable. Without the willingness to face discomfort, contradiction, and loss, neither liberalism nor spirituality can fulfill their original purpose. They become systems for managing people, not for freeing them. The alternative, reclaiming depth, reality, and human freedom without replacing one orthodoxy with another. The alternative to the closed systems described throughout this work is not a return to the past, nor the construction of a new spiritual doctrine, political identity, or psychological framework. It is not a call to reject care, ethics, or responsibility, and it is not an argument for chaos or cruelty disguised as free thought. The alternative is more demanding than any of these. It is a reorientation toward reality that accepts difficulty, limitation, and contradiction as unavoidable features of human life, rather than as problems to be eliminated through belief, language, or compliance. At the core of this alternative is a refusal to moralize cognition, emotion, or embodiment. Thoughts are not virtues. Feelings are not sins. Nervous system states are not character flaws. They are responses arising from specific bodies, histories, and environments. To relate to them honestly requires curiosity rather than judgment, inquiry rather than classification. This does not mean abandoning discernment or accountability, it means grounding them in context. Accountability that ignores circumstance is not ethical clarity, it is punishment. Discernment that collapses complexity is not wisdom, it is fear. This alternative restores the distinction between domains that modern culture has collapsed. Inner life is recognized as meaningful but not omnipotent. Belief influences behavior, but it does not override physics, biology, or material constraint. Emotion informs perception, but it does not determine truth. Thought can shape possibility, but it cannot substitute for resources, safety, or structural change. By re-establishing these boundaries, people are freed from the impossible burden of controlling reality through mindset and freed from the shame that follows when reality refuses to comply. Central to this reorientation is the rehabilitation of long-form thought and slow cognition. Depth is not elitism. It is the natural pace at which complex systems are understood. The alternative insists on spaces where ideas can unfold without being immediately resolved, where disagreement does not trigger exile, and where uncertainty is tolerated long enough to generate insight. This requires patience, stamina, and humility, qualities that cannot be performed quickly or rewarded easily, but which are essential for genuine understanding and transformation. In this alternative, open-mindedness is no longer defined by the correct adoption of approved beliefs or language, but by the capacity to remain present in the face of difference, discomfort, and incomplete knowledge. To be open-minded is not to agree, but to listen without preemptive moral sorting. It is to allow one's assumptions to be challenged without immediately defending identity or belonging. This form of openness is demanding because it offers no immediate emotional payoff. It does not confer status or safety. It asks people to risk being changed. Spirituality, in this framework, returns to being an encounter rather than an identity. It is no longer something one uses to prove alignment or evolution, but something that emerges through lived engagement with finitude, suffering, wonder, and uncertainty. Spiritual maturity is not measured by constant calm or positivity, but by the ability to remain grounded while moving through grief, rage, fear, and joy without denial or projection. It is not a performance of lightness, but a capacity for depth. At a biological and experiential level, this alternative restores respect for the full human waveform. It recognizes that health, insight, and freedom do not arise from maintaining a single elevated state, but from the capacity to move fluidly across states as reality demands. Faster, more activated states have their place in action, expression, and connection, but slower, longer waveforms are where integration occurs. Grounding, stillness, sorrow, and bodily presence allow experience to settle, meaning to form, and repair to take place. These states are not the opposite of growth, they are its foundation. In this orientation, descent is no longer treated as failure, nor is slowness mistaken for stagnation. The body's gravity is trusted. The earthward pull of fatigue, grief, and limitation is understood as anchoring rather than degrading. What emerges is not passivity, but sustainability, a way of living that allows cycles to complete rather than forcing perpetual activation. By honoring the long, slow rhythms through which healing and understanding actually occur, this alternative makes room for forms of care, insight, and solidarity that cannot exist in cultures obsessed with speed, elevation, and constant self-management. Similarly, liberalism is reclaimed not as a set of positions, but as a practice of freedom that requires tolerance for dissent and friction. It accepts that progress is not linear, that moral clarity is often provisional, and that genuine justice cannot be achieved without confronting power, material conditions, and collective responsibility. It rejects the fantasy that social harmony can be achieved through language policing or emotional management, recognizing instead that disagreement and discomfort are intrinsic to pluralistic societies. A crucial feature of this alternative is its relationship to vulnerability and limitation. Rather than treating dependency as failure and resilience as moral superiority, it acknowledges that human beings are interdependent, fragile, and constrained. Bodies break down. Minds fluctuate. Circumstances overwhelm. Any culture that demands constant self-regulation, positivity, or productivity will inevitably exclude those whose lives make such performance impossible. The alternative centers care that is material, relational, and sustained, rather than aesthetic or symbolic. This reorientation also requires confronting loss honestly. Not all suffering can be redeemed. Not all harm leads to growth. Some things are broken and will not be repaired in time. Accepting this is not nihilism, it is realism. It allows grief to be honored rather than reframed as failure, and it allows compassion to arise without conditions. Cultures that cannot tolerate grief will inevitably become cruel, because they must deny what they cannot fix. Importantly, the alternative does not promise safety in the way contemporary movements often do. It does not guarantee belonging, affirmation, or protection from discomfort. What it offers instead is integrity. It offers the possibility of living in closer alignment with reality rather than with ideology, and of building communities that can hold difference without collapsing into either chaos or control. This is not easier than conformity. It is harder. It requires ongoing negotiation rather than static certainty. The alternative also resists scalability in its most seductive forms. Not everything that matters can be mass-produced, branded, or optimized. Some forms of understanding require intimacy, time, and trust. Some conversations cannot be compressed without being distorted. By refusing to treat scale as an unquestioned good, this orientation protects depth from being sacrificed to reach, and meaning from being hollowed out for consumption. Finally, this alternative is intentionally unfinished. It does not offer a new system to believe in, a new hierarchy of virtue, or a new language to enforce. It recognizes that the moment it hardens into doctrine, it will reproduce the very dynamics it seeks to undo. Its commitment is not to being right, but to staying in contact with reality as it unfolds, even when that reality is inconvenient, painful, or resistant to resolution. What this work ultimately argues is not that people must abandon spirituality, liberalism, psychology, or hope, but that they must abandon the fantasy that freedom can be achieved without cost, depth without discomfort, or care without confrontation. The price of reclaiming open-mindedness is the willingness to stand without certainty. The price of genuine compassion is the willingness to face suffering without explanation. And the price of liberation is the courage to remain human in a culture that increasingly demands something else. This is not an ending. It is an opening, one that cannot be completed by belief alone, but only by practice, patience, and a sustained refusal to trade truth for comfort or conformity for belonging. The full wavelength, what vibration actually means in a living system. Everything has vibration. Every thought, emotion, and bodily state carries signal. There is no human experience that exists outside a carrier wave. The mistake this work challenges is not the existence of vibration, but the cultural programming that turns vibration into a moral ladder and treats one band of human state as inherently correct. A living human being requires access to the entire wavelength. Both high vibration and low vibration states are necessary, beneficial, and intelligent in different contexts. Expansion, joy, clarity, motivation, and uplift can be real, healthy, and deeply healing, especially when they are arrived at slowly, built through integration, resourcing, and genuine regulation rather than performance. Likewise, slower and heavier states, grounding, stillness, fatigue, sorrow, withdrawal, deep processing, are not failures. They are often the conditions under which the body integrates experience, releases what it has carried, recalibrates perspective, and repairs. Sorrow in particular can be a form of release and a restoration of truthful orientation, not a sign of regression. Both high and low states can also be harmful. High, positive states become harmful when they are forced, prolonged unnaturally, used as an identity requirement, or demanded as proof of goodness. Low, negative states become harmful when they become stuck, compulsive, disconnected from processing, or used as an identity rather than a phase. What matters is not the label or direction of the state, but what the body needs in the moment, what is appropriate to the context, and whether the state is part of an organic cycle rather than an enforced posture. Health and healing are not defined by staying high. They are defined by the capacity to shift organically across states over time, moving gradually, safely, and responsively through the full spectrum. The body, life, healing, and expansion all require constant natural oscillation, activation and rest, outward engagement and inward integration, intensity and quiet, movement and settling. Real transformation happens through completed cycles, not through permanent elevation. A central harm of modern, high-vibe ideology is that it pushes people out of their actual state and into a performative one. Sudden, coerced, or socially pressured shifts, especially shifts that require people to inhabit states far from their current physiological capacity, are destabilizing and damaging. This is particularly true for neurodivergent people, disabled people, chronically ill people, and those actively healing, whose nervous systems may require slower transitions, longer processing arcs, and more careful titration between states. The harm is not going upward. The harm is being pushed too fast, too far, or without integration. There is also a physics-shaped reversal embedded in the cultural messaging. Constant, high vibration is often treated as movement and progress, but in practice it can become static, a locked state of perpetual activation. Higher frequency states correspond to shorter wavelengths and faster oscillations, which can be energizing and useful, but are also more disruptive and costly when held continuously. Slower, lower frequency states correspond to longer wavelengths and broader arcs, and these longer waveforms often support deeper integration and stability. In that sense, the cultural programming is backwards. It mistakes constant excitation for growth and misreads the longer, slower waveforms of grounding, embodiment, and healing as failure. The body and the earth themselves are not high vibe, in the simplistic moral sense. They are dense, rhythmic, physical, and grounded. Healing is often earthward. It involves slowing, settling, releasing, digesting, and letting reality move through the system. Low vibrational states can be profoundly productive when someone is genuinely doing inner work emotionally, mentally, somatically, because those states can be the doorway to integration rather than the sign of misalignment. The aim is not to police which band of vibrations someone occupies, but to restore the freedom to access the whole spectrum, gradually, honestly, and in accordance with the body's real needs. When people are actively engaging in emotional, mental, or somatic self-work, slower and heavier states often become the very mechanism of healing, allowing stored experience to surface, discharge, reorganize, and resolve rather than remain locked in the system. Final conclusion: the bridge that must be rebuilt. If this work has argued anything consistently, it is that freedom, consciousness, and human dignity cannot survive inside closed systems, no matter how benevolent those systems believe themselves to be. The moment spirituality, philosophy, or political thought becomes primarily about coherence, agreement, and ease of recognition, it begins to lose its ability to expand understanding. When ideas must be immediately digestible, emotionally comfortable, and socially affirming in order to be allowed, they stop being tools for discovery and become instruments of containment. Protecting what is most valuable in human civilization will therefore require a reversal of many current habits. It will require choosing openness over certainty, inquiry over identity, and relationship over alignment. It will require accepting that encountering different philosophies, worldviews, and ways of being does not cancel one's own perspective, nor does it require total agreement. Difference does not have to be resolved in order to be meaningful. In fact, much of what has historically moved humanity forward has emerged precisely from the space between irreconcilable perspectives held in tension long enough to produce something new. A truly open-minded spirituality would not demand that all paths converge into a single narrative of evolution or alignment. It would allow for contradiction, for bodies and minds that do not conform, for suffering that cannot be reframed as growth, and for realities that resist explanation. A truly liberal philosophy would not require uniform moral language or emotional tone in order to defend human rights. It would protect the freedom to question even its own assumptions, recognizing that the suppression of dissent is the beginning of stagnation, not safety. Bridging between philosophies does not mean erasing differences or flattening values. It means developing the capacity to listen without immediately defending identity, to engage without seeking domination, and to remain grounded in one's own convictions without needing them to be universally validated. This capacity is fragile, and it cannot be cultivated in environments that punish slowness, complexity, or emotional honesty. It requires time, trust, and the willingness to be changed by what one encounters. If society is to remain a place worth living, then the work ahead is not merely political or spiritual, but epistemic and ethical at the deepest level. It involves restoring respect for reality over narrative, for embodiment over abstraction, and for human variability over enforced coherence. It involves recognizing that no single framework can contain the fullness of human experience, and that attempts to make one do so inevitably lead to exclusion and harm. Rebuilding this bridge also requires restoring respect for tempo. Human understanding does not move at a single speed, and human lives do not unfold along a single trajectory. Some truths arrive quickly, others require years of lived experience, repetition, loss, and reorientation. Some forms of knowing emerge only through slowness, fatigue, sorrow, or limitation. A culture that cannot tolerate these long waveforms cannot remain open, because it will always privilege those who can move quickly, speak fluently, and remain emotionally light, while filtering out those whose bodies and lives demand a different pace. The bridge that must be rebuilt, then, is not a shortcut between ideologies, but a shared capacity to remain present across difference without forcing resolution. It is a bridge wide enough for dissent as well as ascent, for grounding as well as vision, for silence as well as speech. It allows people to meet without requiring synchronization of belief, emotion, or identity. Such a bridge cannot be engineered through slogans or enforced coherence. It can only be sustained by patience, humility, and a collective willingness to let understanding unfold in its own time. The true expansion of consciousness has never been about rising above humanity. It has always been about returning to it more fully, with greater humility, greater tolerance for uncertainty, and greater commitment to one another's dignity. That expansion cannot be mass-produced, branded, or optimized. It can only be practiced, slowly and imperfectly, through sustained openness to what is real, even when what is real is uncomfortable. If spirituality and philosophy are to remain forces for liberation rather than control, they must once again become places where thinking is allowed to wander, where disagreement is not treated as danger, and where the bridge between differing worldviews is built not by erasing difference, but by honoring it. Anything less may offer belonging, but it will not offer freedom. Author's note. This piece is written in good faith. It is not an attack on individuals, communities, or the ideals of care, justice, or healing. It is an attempt to give language to patterns many people are already living inside, often without the words to name what they are experiencing or why it feels increasingly difficult to think, relate, and belong without self-erasure. What follows is not a rejection of spirituality, liberalism, psychology, or hope. It is a critique of how these domains, when abstracted from reality and organized around moral certainty, emotional performance, and social conformity, can quietly turn into systems of control rather than liberation. The concern here is not intention, but structure. Not bad actors, but recurring dynamics that reward sameness, suppress depth, and fracture solidarity while still presenting themselves as compassionate and progressive. This work is less a takedown than a recovery document. At the heart of this recovery is a clarification that has been badly distorted in contemporary culture: all human states carry signal, movement, and energetic reality. There is no emotion, thought, or bodily condition that exists outside of vibration or waveform. The question is not whether a state is high or low, but what role it plays within a larger cycle of processing, healing, adaptation, and meaning-making. Both expansive and contractive states can be beneficial or harmful depending on timing, duration, context, and capacity. Health does not lie in maintaining any single state, but in retaining access to the full spectrum of human experience and allowing movement across it to occur organically. Much of the cultural confusion addressed in this work comes from a reversal of how living systems actually function. Faster, high-frequency states often labeled as high vibration are associated with short wavelengths, rapid oscillation, and heightened activation. These states can support action, expression, creativity, and connection, but they are also taxing and destabilizing when prolonged or enforced. Slower, lower-frequency states often mislabeled as low vibration involve longer wavelengths, broader arcs of movement, and deeper contact with the body and environment. These states support grounding, integration, repair, grief, perspective, and consolidation. In biological and ecological systems, long waveforms are not inferior, they are often more stable, more penetrating, and more essential for sustained health. A culture that demands constant elevation mistakes perpetual excitation for vitality and treats the very states required for healing as failure. This work therefore rejects both the moralization of low states and the romanticization of high ones. Sudden or forced shifts in state, or prolonged pressure to inhabit states far from one's current physiological capacity, can be deeply destabilizing, particularly for disabled, neurodivergent, chronically ill, or actively healing people. Transformation is not achieved by jumping frequencies, bypassing descent, or overriding the body's needs. It unfolds through gradual movement across the entire wavelength of experience, at a pace the nervous system can tolerate. Sorrow can be clarifying. Stillness can be reparative. Grounding can be expansive. Joy can be disorganizing. None of these states are virtues or failures in themselves. They are phases, and phases only become harmful when they are denied, prolonged unnaturally, or imposed as ideals. It attempts to reclaim epistemic dignity, the right to think slowly, to feel fully, to exist in a body without apology, and to engage ideas without immediately converting them into identity or moral rank. Many of the patterns described here are familiar at an intuitive level. They are rarely examined directly because doing so can feel destabilizing. Naming them clearly may bring relief to some readers and discomfort to others. Both responses are understandable. Nothing in this piece proposes a new ideology, movement, or moral framework. That restraint is intentional. The alternative offered here is not a replacement system, but an orientation, one that prioritizes reality over narrative, depth over digestibility, and relationship over alignment. Any framework that claims to liberate while demanding emotional uniformity or intellectual compliance inevitably reproduces the very harms it seeks to address. This essay was written from lived experience as well as reflection. It emerges from the cost of existing in bodies, minds, and circumstances that cannot perform constant palatability, regulation, or optimism on demand. That perspective does not confer moral authority, but it does ground the analysis in material reality rather than abstraction. The goal is not to provoke outrage or agreement, but to make certain dynamics visible so they can be thought about honestly. Readers are not asked to adopt every conclusion presented here. They are invited to notice patterns, question assumptions, and hold complexity without rushing to resolution. If this work helps even a few people recognize when care is being replaced by control, when healing language is being used to avoid responsibility, or when conformity is masquerading as consciousness, then it has served its purpose. Other non-integrated pieces and random unbiased research related to the subject. To trace the living roots of today's spiritual and liberal subculture reflexes, particularly those that undermine deep, embodied thinking, it is most accurate to treat these patterns as memes with lineages rather than as products of a single origin or controlling force. What appears today as a unified culture is better understood as the convergence of several historically distinct streams that gradually braided together over time and were later compressed and monetized by digital platforms. Three primary parent streams recur throughout this genealogy. The first is 19th-century metaphysical religion, particularly mind cure and new thought traditions that framed belief and inner state as causally primary in shaping health, success, and reality. The second is 20th-century self-help and therapeutic culture, which increasingly treated emotional management and regulation as markers of virtue and maturity. The third is attention engineering, the economic and technological shaping of cognition towards short-form, high salience, incentive-driven processing. In the 2020s, platform economies compressed these streams into scalable, monetizable cultural defaults. What follows maps two major clusters that emerged from this convergence: A, the moral hierarchy of positive high vibration good versus negative low vibration bad, and B, the conditioning of short-form cognition as normal and long-form cognition as difficult, unnecessary, or suspicious. This map also clarifies where persuasion science, behavioral design, and institutional conditioning realistically enter the picture, without resorting to exaggerated claims of centralized control. A, positive high vibration good, and low vibration bad. A large portion of modern, high vibe, morality can be traced to New Thought, a 19th-century American metaphysical movement that taught that mind, belief, and attitude were causally primary. In this framework, health, success, and even external reality were understood to flow from inner state. From this trunk emerged enduring ideas such as, your inner state manifests your outer world, negative emotion is not just painful but wrong or dangerous, and suffering indicates misalignment or spiritual failure. While originally a metaphysical religion, these ideas were gradually stripped of their theological context and repackaged as lifestyle guidance. Layered onto this was the esoteric use of scientific language, particularly the concept of vibration. Late 19th and early 20th century movements such as theosophy borrowed terms from emerging sciences to describe spiritual hierarchies, framing emotional and moral states as energetic frequencies. This language was never intended as physics, but as symbolic description. Nonetheless, it reinforced a laddered worldview in which higher was purer and safer, and lower was contaminated or dangerous, solidifying the moral hierarchy that persists today. In the mid-20th century, positive thinking entered mass culture through popular religion and self-help, notably figures like Norman Vincent Peale. At this point, positive ceased to be merely a coping strategy and became a moral identity. Emotional tone was no longer situational, it became a reflection of character. This moralization was further accelerated in the 2000s by the popularization of manifestation ideology through mass media events such as The Secret, promoted by major tastemakers including Oprah Winfrey's platform. Maintain positive emotional states to attract outcomes, became brandyable, teachable, sellable, and socially enforceable. High vibe only, shifted from belief to norm. Once positivity is moralized, somatically grounding states heaviness, stillness, grief, fatigue, withdrawal, and slow psychological integration are reinterpreted as contamination. The system protects itself by pathologizing the very signals that would return people to bodily reality, nuance, and constraint. Although physics metaphors are often invoked, the issue here is not scientific accuracy. In actual wave physics, frequency and wavelength are inversely related, and neither maps cleanly onto moral value. Spiritual vibes are not measurable wavelengths. What matters is the sorting function. High vibe people are framed as safe and evolved, low vibe people as dangerous or toxic. This mechanism enables social control within communities without requiring any intelligence coordination or malicious intent. B. Short-form cognition versus long-form cognition. Two claims must be separated clearly. The first has strong evidence. Attention in modern environments is structurally engineered towards short, reactive cognition. In information-rich systems, attention becomes the scarce resource, a reality Herbert Simon identified decades ago. Advertising rewards interruption, metrics reward novelty and outrage, and algorithmic feeds reward speed and simplification. Whether framed as imperial or not, the result is a reduced capacity for sustained, integrative thought. The second claim that short-form cognition was deliberately installed by imperial ideology is weaker as stated. What can be responsibly said is that mass persuasion industries have a long, documented history of refining techniques to shape perception at scale. A key historical bridge is Edward Bernays, who normalized public relations as the engineering of consent, arguing that public opinion should be shaped through emotional and symbolic means rather than reasoned debate. While military psychological operations exist, the dominant driver of short-form cognition today is platform and advertising economics, not covert doctrine transmission. Spiritual and liberal communities are particularly vulnerable to this conditioning because they rely heavily on moral language, identity alignment, and social belonging as enforcement mechanisms, while increasingly operating through content formats optimized for feeds, clips, slogans, carousels, and short posts. These communities effectively become self-policing distribution networks for simplified cognition. A realistic conditioning pipeline looks like this. Behavioral science and persuasion techniques develop across academia, military research, marketing, and organizational psychology. These methods are productized through advertising, PR, HR, political consulting, and platform design. Communities then absorb the outputs as common sense. A practical method for tracing lineage is to track specific phrases through their printed history. Terms like high vibration, raise your vibration, good vibes only, manifesting, alignment, or holding space. The key is identifying translation points where ideas jump from esoteric circles to self-help, from self-help to corporate culture, from corporate culture to social justice language, and from there into spiritual influencer content. Conditioning accelerates when practices become virtues, positivity becomes goodness, calm becomes superiority, being triggered becomes inferiority, and complexity becomes harm. In one sentence, the map looks like this: metaphysical mind cure ideas, mass persuasion, therapeutic and HR frameworks, and platform attention economics converge to produce a culture in which feeling good is moralized, dissent is stigmatized, and thinking is compressed into slogans. Expanded historical lineage. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, New Thought and related movements such as Christian Science and prosperity doctrine framed mind as causal, turning inner state into a moral technology. Pain, grief, and anger became spiritually suspicious. This moralization persists today in phrases like, "you attracted this," or, "if you were aligned, you wouldn't feel that." From the late 1800s into the 1930s, esoteric traditions such as theosophy popularized vibration language as a spiritual hierarchy. Higher came to mean purer and safer, lower meant contaminated. Today this appears in social purity logic disguised as, "protect your energy." From the 1920s through the 1960s, mass persuasion became professionalized. Bernays' work established the modern playbook: short phrases, emotional triggers, identity cues, and social proof. Inquiry was displaced by narrative branding. From the 1940s through the 1970s, behaviorism reframed humans as systems to condition rather than meaning makers. Behavior modification frameworks entered education, workplaces, and later product design, making programming language culturally plausible. Metrics, rewards, and penalties replaced messy human reality. During the Cold War, documented intelligence-linked cultural steering efforts, such as the CIA-funded Congress for Cultural Freedom, normalized the idea that culture could be guided indirectly through institutions, funding, and prestige. This era matters not as a conspiracy, but as a proof of concept. Culture could be treated as a steerable system. From the 1960s through the 1990s, humanistic psychology and the human potential movement fused spirituality with therapy and self-optimization. Institutions like Esalen became hubs where spiritual language, psychological tools, and elite networks cross-pollinated. Inner life became a performance domain governed by correct effect, correct speech, and correct identity positioning. From the 1960s onward, CBT and thought management frameworks scaled clinically and culturally. While enormously helpful in context, they introduced a meme that internal narratives are the primary locus of change. When imported into spirituality and politics, structural harm became reframed as mindset, and suffering as failure to do the work. In the late 20th century, positive psychology mainstreamed optimism and well-being as institutional targets. Positivity became compulsory in environments that could not tolerate honesty, giving rise to what is now widely recognized as toxic positivity. From the 2000s onward, algorithmic platforms installed short-form cognition as default. Long-form thinking became structurally disadvantaged. Platform-optimized epistemology taught people that if something is true, it should fit in seconds; if it is complex, it is suspicious; if it is uncomfortable, it is harmful. Community belonging became algorithmic, with slogans replacing conversations and call-outs replacing inquiry. From the 2010s to the present, therapy speak became a governance system within spiritual and progressive communities. Language designed for healing adjudicates status, morality, and belonging. Harm shuts down thought, unhealed, assigns moral rank, and boundaries justify exile. Care is withdrawn from disabled and marginalized people under the guise of wellness. Enforcement, harm, and the alternative. Across these lineages, enforcement operates through social proof, moral sorting, exile disguised as boundaries, and harm language used to stop thought. The harm falls disproportionately on disabled and marginalized people, as vibe culture and accountability theater enable withdrawal of care while preserving a self-image of righteousness. The alternative implied throughout this map is an embodied, complexity-friendly spirituality and a genuinely liberal liberalism that supports long-form thinking, consent-based pluralism, material solidarity, and the ability to tolerate discomfort without exile. QA, how positivity, vibe culture, and short-form thinking became limiting, discriminatory, and divisive. Why isn't positive good actually beneficial? Q, if positivity feels better, why isn't it just good? Because the moment positivity becomes a virtue test, it stops functioning as a tool and starts functioning as a compliance system. Positivity can absolutely be supportive when it arises organically or is used situationally. The harm begins when staying positive becomes a moral requirement rather than a resource. At that point, people are no longer encouraged to process experience, but to override it. Emotion suppression replaces regulation, denial replaces discernment, and wellness becomes a performance rather than a state of health. Psychology already has a name for this pattern: toxic positivity, the pressure to avoid, suppress, or invalidate so-called negative emotions instead of metabolizing them. What is often missed is that this isn't just emotionally harmful, it disrupts biological integration. Human systems require the ability to move through a full range of states. When only pleasant effect is permitted, real processing is cut off, and unresolved experience accumulates under the surface. Positivity supports health when it emerges gradually and is integrated with grounding and rest. It becomes damaging only when it is demanded as a permanent state rather than earned through completed cycles of processing. What are low vibes, and how are they actually protective? Q. Why do lower vibe emotions matter? Because they carry signal. States commonly labeled as low, grief, fatigue, sorrow, anger, confusion, withdrawal are not defects in the system. They are part of how the body and nervous system process reality, integrate experience, and recalibrate to conditions. Teaching people to dismiss these states as low vibration trains them not to listen to their bodies, not to name injustice, and not to tolerate truth unless it feels good. From a biological and energetic perspective, these states often correspond to slower, longer waveforms that allow experience to move through the system rather than fragment it. They support grounding, perspective, immune repair, emotional integration, and meaning-making. This is not spiritual immaturity, it is how living systems heal. An important nuance matters here. Many people use high vibe language because they genuinely want peace, relief, or stability. The harm emerges when that language hardens into a hierarchy. Good people feel good, bad, or unsafe people feel bad. At that point, what looks like spirituality becomes emotional censorship. How do low states become healing instead of harmful? Q. Aren't grief, heaviness, or low states bad if you stay in them too long? Yes, and the same is true of high states. What determines whether a state is harmful or healing is not whether it feels heavy or light, but whether it is being processed, integrated, and allowed to complete a cycle. When someone is actively doing emotional, mental, or somatic self-work, slower and heavier states often become the mechanism of healing rather than a sign of dysfunction. These states allow stored experience to surface, release, reorganize, and resolve. Grief can restore perspective. Sorrow can discharge accumulated strain. Stillness can repair nervous system overload. Grounding can stabilize identity and perception. In these conditions, so-called low states are not stagnation, they are movement occurring at a slower, deeper wavelength. Both high and low states become harmful when they are forced, prolonged unnaturally, or treated as identities instead of phases. Constant positivity can be just as dysregulating as constant despair. Health is not defined by staying elevated, it is defined by retaining access to the entire spectrum of human states and moving across it gradually, in accordance with bodily capacity and context. How does high vibe only become discriminating or ableist? Q. How does vibe culture exile disabled people specifically? Because disability often involves realities that cannot be made consistently pleasant: pain, fatigue, grief, sensory overload, dysregulation, slow processing, healing cycles, and unpredictable capacity. These are not occasional moods, they are ongoing bodily conditions. High vibe only cultures treat those realities as contamination, as personal failures of mindset, or as inconveniences to the group's aesthetic of wellness and progress. Belonging in these spaces quietly becomes conditional. One must perform wellness, remain palatable, minimize need, and translate suffering into inspiration rather than truth. This is how exile occurs without anyone naming it as such. If belonging requires pleasant effect, disabled and chronically ill people are pushed out by design, even while the community continues to describe itself as compassionate. Why is the toxic person label such a powerful part of the conditioning? Q. What's wrong with calling people toxic? Sometimes people are genuinely abusive, and protecting oneself is necessary. But the pattern you're pointing to is different. It collapses complex human situations into a single word disposal mechanism. When toxic becomes a default label, context disappears, causality disappears, and the possibility of repair disappears. Poverty, trauma, isolation, power imbalance, and systemic harm vanish from view, replaced by a moral verdict. This trains communities to practice social hygiene rather than human ethics. Boundaries become exile. Accountability becomes punishment theater. Moral superiority replaces discernment. It is especially effective for divide and conquer dynamics because it turns collective problems into individual contaminants to be removed, rather than conditions to be addressed. Why does this turn into divide and conquer? Q. How does vibe culture distract from the big picture? Because it redirects attention away from shared material reality and toward constant interpersonal policing. Instead of focusing on power structures, resource distribution, systemic discrimination, disability access, mutual aid, or exploitation, communities become absorbed in tone, wording, vibe, purity, and identity performance. These are endless, low-stakes conflicts that exhaust people without threatening existing power. It functions as an attention sink. Solidarity fractures into micro-trials and social punishments. The more a movement talks about vibes and emotional correctness, the less it has to confront material responsibility. Division is achieved without overt repression. Long form versus short form, what's the real mechanism? Q. Why does short form thinking dominate now? Because we live in an attention economy where attention, not information, is the scarce resource. Herbert S. Simon's insight still holds: when information is abundant, systems evolve to capture attention. Modern platforms reward novelty, outrage, speed, certainty, identity cues, and repeatable slogans. Long-form thinking, by contrast, requires ambiguity tolerance, sustained attention, slow integration, and the ability to remain with discomfort without immediate resolution. These are biologically slower processes that depend on longer waveforms of attention and cognition. Platforms and communities shaped by them systematically select against these capacities. Is there evidence short-form media is linked with attention problems? Q. Are we just being dramatic about reels and shorts? No. While causality is complex, there is growing and mainstream research linking heavy short-form video use with attentional outcomes, including increased inattentive behaviors. Recent large-scale reviews and meta-analyses have examined cognitive and mental health correlates of short-form media use. Even without perfect lab causality, the cultural effect is visible. Norms reward speed and punish depth. Your argument doesn't require proving that short-form media single-handedly causes attention problems. It rests on the observable reality that environments structured around speed, compression, and constant stimulation train people away from integrative thought. How does short-form thinking suppress revolutionary perspectives? Q. Why does short-form suppress new perspectives? Because genuinely new perspectives usually require chains of reasoning, historical context, competing truths, emotional complexity, and time. Short-form discourse punishes all of this. It favors instantly legible positions, mimetic repetition, moral sorting, and simplified villains. Short-form cognition can create consensus very quickly. It can also produce shallow thinking just as quickly. Complexity, the soil in which real insight grows, becomes suspect. How does this make liberalism illiberal? Q. What makes modern freedom of expression spaces feel limiting and judgmental? Not policy, but epistemology and social enforcement. When a community enforces one approved interpretation, one approved emotional tone, one approved vocabulary, and punishes dissent or nuance with reputational death, inquiry collapses. That is orthodoxy, even if it speaks the language of liberation. Freedom of expression becomes constrained socially rather than legally. Spirituality becomes organized spirituality. Liberalism becomes a conformity machine. Where do psychology concepts become a control system? Q. Isn't therapy language good? It can be. The harm begins when it becomes governance. A healing vocabulary turns into a control vocabulary when it is used to end dialogue. That's harmful. Rank moral worth, you're unhealed, justify exclusion, boundaries, as banishment, or offload responsibility, I can't hold space, instead of, I will materially support you. Toxic positivity is one of the clearest examples. It invalidates emotion, disrupts processing, and isolates suffering while preserving a moralized appearance of care. Putting it all together, without conspiracy. What's installed are two core social beliefs: positivity equals moral status, and short form equals legitimate truth. The mechanism is straightforward. In an attention economy, systems optimize for capture, and toxic positivity suppresses emotional processing. Enforcement happens through tone policing, vibe policing, purity tests, and therapy language used as social weaponry. The harm falls disproportionately on disabled and marginalized people who cannot perform palatability. The result is predictable: spirituality becomes church, activism becomes orthodoxy, depth becomes suspect, and real transformation becomes impossible. The alternative is not chaos or cruelty. It is long-form space, embodied emotional processing, boundaries with care rather than disposal, material solidarity, and respect for the full human wavelength. It is a culture that understands that both slow and fast states, both grounding and expansion, are necessary and that freedom depends on the ability to move through them without coercion.